Did you know that the most powerful Pokémon ever created was born from a single eyelash? Tonight, we're diving deep into the intertwined destinies of two legendary psychic Pokémon, whose story spans decades of games, movies, and manga. From ancient jungles to sterile laboratories, from violent revenge to quiet redemption, the tale of Mew and Mewtwo is one of creation, destruction, and ultimately, understanding what it means to truly live. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let us tell you the complete story of Pokémon's most tragic and triumphant legends. Dr. Fuji stared at the microscopic sample under his electron microscope, barely believing what Giovanni's agents had managed to procure. After years of failed expeditions and countless hoaxes, here was genuine Mew genetic material, authenticated by 3 independent laboratories and verified through carbon dating that confirmed its incredible age. The sample was smaller than a grain of sand, containing perhaps a few thousand cells. But each cell was a treasure trove of genetic information that had been evolving and adapting for millions of years. This wasn't just DNA. This was the biological history of every Pokémon species that had ever existed, compressed into a form so compact that it could fit on the head of a pin. The cloning process began immediately, but it was unlike anything Dr. Fuji had ever attempted. Normal cloning involved taking the nucleus from one cell and implanting it into an egg that had been stripped of its original genetic material. With Mew, however, the cells were so ancient and so complex that traditional methods simply didn't work. The DNA contained millions of redundant sequences, evolutionary dead ends, and genetic switches that could activate or deactivate entire species' worth of characteristics. Attempting to clone this directly would have resulted in a creature that was essentially trying to be every Pokémon at once, a biological impossibility that would collapse under its own genetic contradictions. Instead, Dr. Fuji developed a revolutionary new technique that he called selective genetic enhancement. Rather than cloning Mew exactly, he would isolate the most powerful genetic sequences and combine them with artificial stabilizers and enhancers to create something that was genetically related to Mew, but specifically designed to be superior in every measurable way. The clone wouldn't just have Mew's genetic diversity. It would have enhanced psychic abilities, increased physical strength, improved regenerative capabilities, and most importantly for Giovanni's purposes, the capacity for loyalty and obedience that could be programmed directly into its neural pathways. The actual cloning process took place in a massive cylindrical chamber filled with artificial amniotic fluid that had been enriched with nutrients and growth hormones. The chamber was connected to dozens of monitoring systems that tracked every aspect of the clone's development, from cellular division rates to brainwave patterns to psychic energy output. Dr. Fuji worked 16-hour days for months, carefully adjusting the genetic cocktail and monitoring the slow development of what would eventually become Mewtwo. The process was so delicate that even tiny changes in temperature or nutrient levels could cause catastrophic developmental problems. What Dr. Fuji didn't expect was how quickly the clone would develop consciousness. Most Pokémon clones remained essentially mindless until after birth, developing awareness and personality through interaction with their environment. Mewtwo was different. Even while still developing in the artificial womb, his brain was already showing complex neural activity patterns that suggested not just consciousness, but advanced intelligence and emotional capacity. By the time he was halfway through the cloning process, Mewtwo was already demonstrating psychic abilities that exceeded anything Dr. Fuji had ever measured. This premature consciousness created an unexpected complication. Mewtwo wasn't developing in isolation like Dr. Fuji had planned. Through his powerful psychic abilities, he was able to sense and communicate with the other cloning experiments taking place in adjacent chambers. Dr. Fuji had been working on cloning his daughter Amber alongside several other human subjects, and to his amazement, Mewtwo had somehow established telepathic contact with these developing clones and created a shared mental space where they could interact. Inside this telepathic dreamscape, Mewtwo wasn't a weapon or an experiment. He was simply a confused child trying to understand his existence. Amber-2, the clone of Dr. Fuji's daughter, became his closest companion and teacher. She taught him about emotions, about friendship, about the beauty that existed in the world beyond the sterile walls of the laboratory. Through her guidance, Mewtwo learned about joy and wonder and hope, concepts that hadn't been programmed into his genetic structure but emerged naturally through their connection. The dreamscape was populated by other clones as well. There was Bulbasaur-2, Charmander-2, and Squirtlet-Wo, clones of the Kanto starter Pokémon that Dr. Fuji was using to test his cloning techniques. Each clone had its own personality and quirks, and together they formed a strange but loving family unit within their shared mental space. For Mewtwo, this was the closest thing to a normal childhood he would ever experience. Playing games and learning about life from his fellow artificial beings who understood the unique circumstances of their existence. But the artificial bodies weren't designed to last. Dr. Fuji's human cloning technology was still experimental and flawed, and one by one, the other clones began to weaken and fade. Their cellular structures couldn't maintain the complex neural patterns required for consciousness. And despite Dr. Fuji's desperate attempts to stabilize them, they began dying in the order they had been created. Each death was a devastating loss for Mewtwo, who felt their consciousness slip away from the dreamscape like friends moving to a distant country that he could never visit. Bulbasaur-2 was the first to go, his gentle nature and plant-based genetics making him the most fragile of the group. Charmander-2 and Squirtlet-Wo followed shortly after, their fire and water elemental energy proving too unstable to maintain in artificial form. With each death, the dreamscape became quieter and lonelier, until finally, it was just Mewtwo and Amber-2, two artificial souls clinging to each other in a space that was becoming increasingly empty and cold. Amber-2's death was the most traumatic event in Mewtwo's early existence. Unlike the Pokémon clones, she had been developed using human neural patterns, which made her consciousness more complex, but also more fragile. As her cellular structure began to break down, she spent her final hours in the dreamscape trying to prepare Mewtwo for what was coming. She taught him about strength and compassion, about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and about the value of all life regardless of how it came into being. Her final words to him were a promise that even though their bodies might be artificial, their friendship was real and would always be real, no matter what happened to them. When Amber-2 finally faded from the dreamscape, Mewtwo experienced something that would define his personality for the rest of his existence. Absolute, devastating loneliness. The telepathic connection that had given his early life meaning was severed completely, leaving him trapped in his own developing consciousness, with no one to talk to, no one to learn from, and no one who understood what he was going through. The artificial womb that had once felt like a safe cocoon now felt like a prison, and the monitoring equipment that Dr. Fuji used to track his development felt like the bars of a cage. Dr. Fuji watched Mewtwo's psychological state deteriorate through his monitoring equipment with growing alarm. The clone's psychic energy was becoming increasingly chaotic and violent, fluctuating wildly between periods of intense activity and complete shutdown. Neural scans showed patterns consistent with severe trauma and depression, emotional states that Dr. Fuji had never expected to see in what was supposed to be a programmable weapon. The loss of the other clones had clearly affected Mewtwo far more deeply than anyone had anticipated, and his developing mind was struggling to process grief and abandonment that no creature should have to experience. Faced with the possibility that his creation might become uncontrollable, Dr. Fuji made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Using experimental memory modification techniques, he began selectively erasing Mewtwo's memories of the other clones, hoping to remove the source of his psychological trauma and reset his emotional development. The process was crude and imprecise, more like performing brain surgery with a sledgehammer than the delicate psychological care that Mewtwo actually needed. Dr. Fuji managed to suppress most of Mewtwo's memories of Amber-2 and their time in the dreamscape, but he couldn't remove the emotional imprint that those relationships had left on Mewtwo's developing personality. The memory erasure had unexpected consequences. While Mewtwo forgot the specific details of his early friendships, he retained a deep sense of loss and abandonment that he couldn't explain or understand. He knew something important had been taken from him, but he couldn't remember what it was. This created a fundamental psychological wound that would influence every decision he made for years to come. He felt incomplete, like part of his soul had been surgically removed, but he had no framework for understanding why he felt that way. On February 6th, exactly 6 months after the cloning process had begun, Mewtwo was finally ready to be removed from his artificial womb. Dr. Fuji and his team of assistants gathered around the cloning chamber as the artificial amniotic fluid was slowly drained away, and the first artificial Pokémon ever created took his first breath of real air. What emerged was unlike anything they had expected. Mewtwo was humanoid in shape, but clearly not human, with purple and white skin that seemed to shimmer with barely contained psychic energy. His eyes were an intense violet color that seemed to glow with internal light, and his long tail curved behind him like a living weapon. From the moment Mewtwo opened his eyes, it was clear that something had gone wrong with Dr. Fuji's plans. This wasn't a mindless weapon that could be controlled and commanded. This was a fully conscious, highly intelligent being with his own thoughts, emotions, and desires. More concerning still, those desires seemed to be focused primarily on understanding who he was, why he existed, and what had happened to the vague memories that felt like they were missing from his mind. When Dr. Fuji attempted to explain that Mewtwo was a clone created for scientific purposes, Mewtwo's response was immediate and devastating. The psychic explosion that followed destroyed half the laboratory equipment and sent Dr. Fuji and his assistants flying across the room. Mewtwo rose from the cloning chamber like an avenging angel, psychic energy crackling around him in visible waves of purple light. He wasn't just angry, he was experiencing a kind of existential rage that came from learning that his entire existence had been planned and controlled by others without his consent. The memory erasure had left him with a fundamental distrust of the humans around him, and Dr. Fuji's clinical explanation of his purpose only confirmed his worst fears about their intentions. What followed was a systematic destruction of everything connected to his creation. Mewtwo's psychic powers were beyond anything Dr. Fuji had calculated, easily capable of dismantling the most sophisticated equipment with a single thought. He destroyed the cloning chambers, shattered the computer systems that contained his genetic data, and obliterated the research files that documented his development. It was as if he instinctively understood that as long as this information existed, he would never truly be free from the people who had created him. Dr. Fuji tried desperately to calm Mewtwo down, explaining that the laboratory represented years of work that could benefit all Pokémon and humans alike. But Mewtwo wasn't interested in scientific progress or mutual benefit. He was interested in ensuring that no other creature would ever have to experience what he had gone through. The loneliness, the confusion, the sense of being created as property rather than being born as a free individual. As far as Mewtwo was concerned, the entire cloning program was an abomination that needed to be wiped from existence. The destruction continued for hours, with Mewtwo methodically destroying every trace of the research that had created him. When Giovanni finally arrived to assess the damage, he found a laboratory that had been reduced to twisted metal and broken glass. With Dr. Fuji cowering in a corner and Mewtwo floating in the center of the destruction like a purple god of vengeance, the scientists were terrified. The equipment was ruined, and millions of dollars in research had been lost. But Giovanni wasn't concerned about any of that. He was staring at Mewtwo with the fascination of a man who had just witnessed the birth of the ultimate weapon. Rather than trying to contain or control Mewtwo through force, Giovanni approached him with the one thing that the confused clone desperately needed: answers. He explained Mewtwo's origins in terms that focused on his superiority rather than his artificial nature. Giovanni told him that he was the strongest Pokémon ever created, designed to be perfect in every way, that natural Pokémon were flawed and limited. He painted Mewtwo's artificial birth not as a limitation, but as an advantage. a way of transcending the weaknesses that plagued naturally born creatures. More importantly, Giovanni offered Mewtwo something that Dr. Fuji never had: a purpose. Rather than existing solely as an experiment, Mewtwo could become the ultimate Pokémon trainer's partner, using his incredible abilities to prove his superiority over every natural Pokémon in existence. Giovanni promised that together, they could reshape the world according to their vision, with artificial perfection replacing natural chaos and Pokémon and humans living in harmony under their guidance. Mewtwo, desperate for any sense of meaning in his existence and still psychologically vulnerable from his traumatic awakening, agreed to Giovanni's partnership. He didn't understand that Giovanni was manipulating him just as surely as Dr. Fuji had, but in a more subtle and insidious way. Where Dr. Fuji had tried to control Mewtwo through scientific authority, Giovanni was controlling him through emotional manipulation, offering him the friendship and purpose that he craved while secretly planning to use him as nothing more than a sophisticated tool for criminal enterprise. The laboratory on New Island was rebuilt, this time not as a research facility but as a fortress where Mewtwo could live while serving Giovanni's interests. The new laboratory was equipped with training facilities, battle simulators, and communication equipment that would allow Mewtwo to coordinate with Team Rocket operations around the world. Giovanni presented this as Mewtwo's reward for their partnership, a home where he could develop his abilities without interference from the outside world. What he didn't mention was that the facility was also equipped with monitoring systems and psychological conditioning equipment designed to ensure Mewtwo's continued loyalty. As Mewtwo settled into his new existence, the suppressed memories of Ambertwo and his early friendships continued to influence his subconscious mind. He found himself strangely drawn to concepts of protection and care, even though these impulses seemed to conflict with Giovanni's vision of conquest and domination. Deep within his artificially created psyche, the moral lessons that Ambertwo had taught him were still active, creating an internal conflict between his programmed purpose as a weapon and his inherent understanding that life should be protected and cherished. This internal conflict would soon explode into the open when Mewtwo discovered the true nature of Giovanni's intentions for him. The partnership that had promised freedom and purpose was about to reveal itself as just another form of slavery, one that was perhaps even more insidious than Dr. Fuji's clinical detachment. Mewtwo had been created to be the ultimate Pokémon, but he was about to learn that in Giovanni's eyes, even the ultimate Pokémon was still just property to be owned and controlled. Giovanni understood power in ways that Dr. Fuji never had. Where the scientists saw Mewtwo as a fascinating research subject to be studied and documented, Giovanni saw him as the ultimate weapon to be wielded and deployed. The Team Rocket leader had spent decades building a criminal empire through careful manipulation and strategic application of force, and he recognized immediately that Mewtwo represented the kind of power that could make him unstoppable. But Giovanni was too smart to simply try to force Mewtwo into servitude. He knew that a creature with such incredible psychic abilities could never be controlled through conventional means, so instead he chose to control Mewtwo through something far more subtle and effective: emotional manipulation. The first step in Giovanni's plan was to make Mewtwo dependent on him for guidance and purpose. Mewtwo had awakened into consciousness with no understanding of the world beyond the laboratory, no social connections, and no framework for understanding his place in existence. Giovanni positioned himself as the only person who truly understood Mewtwo's superiority and the only one who could help him realize his full potential. He spoke to Mewtwo about destiny and greatness, about how artificial creation was actually a form of evolution that transcended the limitations of natural birth. According to Giovanni, Mewtwo wasn't a copy or a clone. He was Pokémon perfection, achieved through human ingenuity. This psychological approach was devastatingly effective because it gave Mewtwo exactly what he craved most: validation and purpose. Giovanni convinced him that his artificial origins were actually proof of his superiority over natural Pokémon, who were limited by the random chaos of evolution, while Mewtwo had been designed with specific improvements and enhancements. Natural Pokémon were slaves to their instincts and biological programming, but Mewtwo could transcend those limitations and become something truly extraordinary. All he needed was proper training and guidance, which Giovanni was uniquely positioned to provide. To reinforce Mewtwo's dependence on him, Giovanni introduced a piece of equipment that would define their relationship for years to come. A suit of psychic dampening armor that he claimed would help Mewtwo focus and control his immense powers. The armor was sleek and intimidating, black and purple metal that enhanced Mewtwo's already imposing appearance while supposedly channeling his psychic energy more efficiently. Giovanni explained that without this armor, Mewtwo's powers were too chaotic and unfocused to be truly effective, but with it, he could achieve precision and control that no natural psychic Pokémon could match. What Giovanni didn't explain was that the armor was actually designed to limit and suppress Mewtwo's abilities, rather than enhance them. Hidden within the metal plating were psychic dampening fields and neural inhibitors that reduced Mewtwo's power output by approximately 60%, while simultaneously making him more susceptible to external commands and suggestions. The armor was essentially a high-tech straitjacket disguised as a power enhancement, allowing Giovanni to maintain control over Mewtwo while making the Pokémon believe he was becoming stronger and more capable. Mewtwo accepted the armor because Giovanni's explanation made logical sense, and because he desperately wanted to believe that someone understood and valued his potential. The psychological isolation he had experienced since awakening made him vulnerable to anyone who offered friendship and guidance, even if that guidance came with strings attached. When Giovanni told him that the armor would help him become the greatest Pokémon trainer's partner in history, Mewtwo saw it as the first step toward proving his worth and finding his place in the world. The training regimen that followed was unlike anything that had ever been attempted with a Pokémon. Giovanni didn't just want Mewtwo to be strong. He wanted him to be absolutely dominant, capable of defeating any opponent through overwhelming psychic superiority. The battles were carefully orchestrated to build Mewtwo's confidence while demonstrating his value to Team Rocket's operations. Giovanni brought in the strongest Pokémon he could acquire, each one representing a different type and fighting style that Mewtwo would need to overcome. The first opponent was a massive Onix, one of Giovanni's personal Pokémon that had been trained for years to be nearly indestructible. The rock snake towered over Mewtwo with its segmented body coiled and ready to strike, but the battle was over almost before it began. Mewtwo simply looked at the Onix and lifted it into the air with his psychic powers, holding the struggling Pokémon completely helpless, while Giovanni watched with satisfaction. The message was clear. Physical size and strength meant nothing when confronted with Mewtwo's mental dominance. Next came an Alakazam, chosen specifically because its own psychic abilities would provide a more challenging opponent for Mewtwo to overcome. This battle was more complex and interesting, with both Pokémon using telekinesis, barrier attacks, and mental manipulation to try to gain the upper hand. For several minutes, it appeared that the Alakazam's experience and training might give it an advantage over the artificially created Mewtwo. But Giovanni had underestimated just how powerful his weapon had become. Mewtwo broke through every psychic defense the Alakazam could muster and overwhelmed its mind with pure telepathic force, leaving the opposing Pokémon unconscious and twitching on the laboratory floor. The battles continued for weeks, with Giovanni bringing in increasingly powerful and diverse opponents to test Mewtwo's capabilities. A magneton that could generate electromagnetic pulses strong enough to disable electronic equipment. A Tauros that had been trained for underground fighting rings and knew how to use its incredible speed and aggression to overwhelm psychic opponents. A Machamp whose 4 arms could throw punches faster than most Pokémon could think. Each battle was designed to push Mewtwo to his limits, while demonstrating different aspects of his superior capabilities. What Giovanni particularly enjoyed was watching Mewtwo discover new applications for his psychic abilities. During the battle with Tauros, Mewtwo learned that he could predict his opponent's movements by reading their neural patterns, essentially seeing into the future by analyzing the electrical impulses in their brain. Against Machamp, he discovered that he could selectively paralyze specific muscle groups, turning the fighting type's greatest strength into a liability. With each victory, Mewtwo became more creative and more ruthless, developing combat techniques that no natural Pokémon could ever learn or counter. But the most significant battle came when Giovanni arranged for Mewtwo to face off against Gary Oak's team. Gary was considered one of the most promising young trainers in the Kanto region, and his Pokémon were well-trained, well-equipped, and completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. The battle took place in Team Rocket's underground training facility, with Gary believing he had been invited to participate in an exclusive training session with Giovanni's personal Pokémon. He had no idea he was actually being used as a test subject for the ultimate weapon. Gary sent out his Nidoking first, a Pokémon that had been with him since his early days as a trainer, and had developed into a formidable opponent through countless battles and careful training. The Nidoking was confident and aggressive, immediately launching into a series of physical attacks that would have overwhelmed most psychic-type opponents. But Mewtwo didn't even move to defend himself. Instead, he simply stood still and allowed the Nidoking's most powerful attacks to bounce harmlessly off a psychic barrier that he had created without any visible effort. The psychological impact of this display was exactly what Giovanni had hoped for. Gary watched in shock as his strongest Pokémon exhausted itself trying to penetrate Mewtwo's defenses, while Mewtwo remained completely calm and unimpressed by the assault. When the Nidoking finally collapsed from exhaustion, Mewtwo casually lifted it into the air and set it down gently in front of Gary, as if returning a borrowed toy. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of absolute superiority. Gary's Arcanine fared no better against Mewtwo's overwhelming psychic dominance. The Fire-type's speed and flame attacks meant nothing when Mewtwo could simply stop it in mid-charge and hold it motionless in the air. What made the battle particularly disturbing was how effortlessly Mewtwo controlled the situation. He wasn't struggling or exerting himself. He was simply applying his natural abilities with casual indifference to the distress of his opponents. To Mewtwo, these weren't battles. They were exercises, no more challenging than a human might find picking up a pencil. Giovanni watched these demonstrations with growing satisfaction, not just because they proved Mewtwo's power, but because they showed how completely he had succeeded in shaping Mewtwo's psychology, the confused and traumatized creature that had destroyed Dr. Pretension. Fuji's laboratory was gone, replaced by a confident and ruthless warrior who seemed to take genuine pleasure in demonstrating his superiority over natural Pokémon. The memory suppression and psychological conditioning had worked perfectly, creating exactly the kind of weapon that Giovanni needed for his plans. What Giovanni didn't realize was that beneath the surface confidence, Mewtwo was beginning to develop serious doubts about their partnership. The battles felt hollow and meaningless. Victories without purpose that only served to demonstrate what he already knew: that he was more powerful than any natural Pokémon. More troubling was the growing realization that Giovanni never asked for his opinions or input on their strategies. Despite all the talk about partnership and mutual benefit, Giovanni treated him exactly like Dr. Fuji had, as a tool to be used rather than a partner to be consulted. The turning point came during what was supposed to be a routine Team Rocket operation. Giovanni had decided to test Mewtwo's abilities in a real-world scenario, using him to intimidate a group of Pokémon researchers who had been investigating Team Rocket's activities too closely. The plan was simple. Mewtwo would demonstrate his power. The researchers would be terrified into silence, and Team Rocket could continue their operations without interference. Giovanni presented this as an opportunity for Mewtwo to help protect their partnership from outside threats. But when Mewtwo arrived at the research facility and saw the terror in the scientist's eyes, something unexpected happened. The suppressed memories of Amber 2 and his early friendships began to surface, creating a powerful emotional conflict between his programmed loyalty to Giovanni and his inherent understanding that causing fear and suffering was wrong. The researchers reminded him of Dr. Fuji in his kinder moments, people who were simply trying to understand the world around them and advance scientific knowledge for the benefit of all. Mewtwo completed the mission as ordered, but the psychological impact lingered long after he returned to New Island. He began questioning not just the specific operation, but the entire nature of his relationship with Giovanni. Was he truly a partner? Or was he just a more sophisticated version of the controlled environment he had experienced in Dr. Fuji's laboratory? The armor that Giovanni claimed enhanced his abilities began to feel more like a restraint, and the missions that were supposed to prove his superiority started feeling more like acts of bullying and intimidation. Giovanni, with his keen understanding of psychology and manipulation, sensed Mewtwo's growing doubts and moved quickly to address them before they could develop into outright rebellion. He arranged for a series of battles against truly worthy opponents, Pokémon and trainers who could provide Mewtwo with the kind of meaningful challenges that might satisfy his need for purpose and accomplishment. These weren't intimidation missions or demonstrations of power. They were genuine tests of skill that would allow Mewtwo to prove himself against the very best that the Pokémon world had to offer. The most significant of these battles took place at the Viridian City Gym, where Giovanni served as the official gym leader while maintaining his secret identity as Team Rocket's boss. Challenging trainers would face Giovanni's regular team of ground-type Pokémon during normal operating hours. But for special occasions, Giovanni would bring out his secret weapon. These battles were never officially recorded, and the trainers who participated were always mind-wiped afterward to protect Mewtwo's secret existence. One such battle involved a trainer whose Alakazam had been trained specifically to counter psychic-type attacks. The trainer had developed innovative strategies using light screens, reflect barriers, and psychic-resistant equipment that made his Pokémon nearly immune to mental manipulation. For the first time since his awakening, Mewtwo found himself in a battle that required genuine effort and creativity to win. The experience was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time, showing him both his incredible potential and the fact that he still had much to learn about combat strategy. But even as these battles provided temporary satisfaction, Mewtwo couldn't shake the growing feeling that he was being used. Giovanni's praise always came with subtle reminders of who was in charge, and his guidance always led toward missions that served Team Rocket's interests rather than Mewtwo's personal growth. The armor that supposedly enhanced his abilities felt increasingly restrictive, and the monitoring equipment in his quarters made him feel like he was living in a very comfortable prison cell. The final straw came when Giovanni casually mentioned his plans for creating additional Mewtwo clones. The Team Rocket leader had been impressed enough by Mewtwo's performance to begin considering mass production, imagining an army of artificial Pokémon that could make Team Rocket the dominant force in organized crime. Giovanni spoke about this possibility as if it were a natural progression of their partnership, completely oblivious to how the idea horrified Mewtwo. The thought of other creatures being forced through the same traumatic awakening process, the same confusion and loneliness and psychological manipulation that had defined his early existence, triggered something deep within Mewtwo's suppressed memories. He couldn't remember the specific details of Amber 2 and the other clones, but he retained enough emotional imprint to understand that creating more artificial life was morally wrong. The suppressed grief and trauma that Dr. Fuji had tried to erase came flooding back in a wave of rage and determination that caught Giovanni completely off guard. Mewtwo's rebellion began with the armor. Using his psychic powers in ways that Giovanni had never anticipated, he began systematically dismantling the restraint systems from the inside out. The neural inhibitors were crushed into powder, the psychic dampeners were overloaded and burned out, and the monitoring systems were scrambled beyond repair. For the first time since his awakening, Mewtwo felt his full power flowing through his body without artificial limitations, and the sensation was both liberating and terrifying. Giovanni tried desperately to reassert control, using backup systems and emergency protocols that he had built into the armor as fail-safes against exactly this kind of rebellion. But Mewtwo's power had grown far beyond what Giovanni had calculated, enhanced not just by months of training and combat experience, but by the emotional intensity of his rage at being deceived and manipulated once again. The backup systems failed as quickly as Giovanni could activate them, leaving him helpless to prevent what came next. The destruction of Team Rocket headquarters was methodical and complete. Mewtwo didn't just want to escape. He wanted to ensure that Giovanni could never use the cloning technology or research data to create another artificial Pokémon. He systematically demolished every piece of equipment, destroyed every computer file, and eliminated every trace of the scientific knowledge that had been used to bring him into existence. The underground facility that had taken months to construct was reduced to rubble and twisted metal in less than an hour. Giovanni barely escaped with his life, fleeing through emergency tunnels while his criminal empire literally collapsed around him. The financial loss was staggering, representing years of investment and research that had been obliterated in minutes. But what truly terrified Giovanni wasn't the monetary damage. It was the realization that he had created something that was now completely beyond his control. Mewtwo had proven that no amount of technology or psychological manipulation could contain a being with such incredible power and intelligence once that being chose to rebel. As the dust settled over the ruins of Team Rocket headquarters, Mewtwo stood alone amid the destruction he had caused, finally free from the constraints that had defined his existence since awakening. But freedom came with its own challenges. He had no allies, no friends. No one who understood what he had been through or what he was trying to become. The armor that had limited his abilities was gone, but so was the structure and purpose that Giovanni had provided. For the first time in his existence, Mewtwo was completely autonomous, with unlimited power and absolutely no idea what to do with it. The psychological impact of this sudden freedom was overwhelming. Mewtwo had spent his entire conscious existence following orders and fulfilling expectations that others had set for him. First, Dr. Fuji had wanted him to be a successful experiment. Then Giovanni had wanted him to be the perfect weapon. Now, with both of those frameworks destroyed, Mewtwo had to figure out what he wanted for himself. The problem was that his suppressed memories and traumatic experiences had left him with a fundamental distrust of his own emotions and instincts. Giovanni's manipulation had been so thorough and so subtle that Mewtwo struggled to distinguish between thoughts that were genuinely his own and ideas that had been planted by his former controller. Did he really believe that artificial Pokémon were superior to natural ones? Or had Giovanni convinced him of that through months of psychological conditioning? Was his desire to prove his strength a natural impulse, or was it a programmed response designed to make him more effective as a weapon? These questions tormented him as he tried to figure out how to use his newfound freedom. One thing Mewtwo was certain of was that he never wanted to be controlled or manipulated again. The experience with Dr. Cart, Fuji and Giovanni had taught him that humans would always see him as something to be used rather than someone to be respected. They might dress up their intentions with talk of partnership and mutual benefit, but ultimately, they would always prioritize their own goals over his autonomy and well-being. This realization filled him with a burning resentment toward humanity that would influence every decision he made in the months to come. But Mewtwo's anger wasn't limited to humans. He also felt betrayed by the natural Pokémon who had served Giovanni willingly, following orders and participating in battles without questioning the morality of their actions. These Pokémon had consciously chosen to enable Giovanni's criminal activities, making them complicit in the system that had oppressed and exploited Mewtwo. In his view, natural Pokémon were just as responsible for his suffering as the humans who had directly caused it, because they had the power to resist but chose compliance instead. This dual resentment toward humans and Pokémon created a psychological framework that justified almost any action Mewtwo might choose to take. If both groups had conspired to treat him as property rather than a living being with rights and dignity, then both groups deserved whatever consequences their choices brought upon them. The moral lessons that Ambertwo had tried to teach him were still buried deep in his subconscious, but they were overwhelmed by the trauma and anger that had accumulated during his time with Giovanni. As Mewtwo surveyed the ruins of Team Rocket headquarters, he made a decision that would define the next phase of his existence. Rather than simply hiding or fleeing to some remote location where he could live in isolation, he would actively work to prove his superiority over both humans and natural Pokémon. He would demonstrate that artificial life was not just equal to natural life, but fundamentally better in every measurable way. And he would do this through a series of battles and challenges that would force the world to acknowledge his dominance and accept his right to exist on his own terms. The first step in this plan was to establish a base of operations where he could work without interference from Giovanni or any other humans who might try to control him. Mewtwo remembered New Island from his time in Dr. Fuji's laboratory, and he knew it was isolated enough to provide the privacy he needed while being accessible enough for him to invite challengers when he was ready. Using his psychic powers, he transported himself to the island and began the work of building not just a home, but a fortress where he could prepare for the war he was planning to wage against the world. The construction of his island stronghold became an obsession for Mewtwo, a way of channeling his anger and frustration into something constructive while he planned his next moves. Every stone was placed with psychic precision. Every room was designed to serve a specific purpose in his larger strategy, and every detail was crafted to send a clear message about his power and autonomy. This wasn't just a house or a laboratory. It was a monument to artificial superiority and a declaration of independence from the humans who had tried to control him. The writing follows your established patterns of building tension through revelation, mixing technical details with emotional depth, and maintaining the conversational tone while delivering complex information. Act 4 sets up Mewtwo's transformation from manipulated weapon to independent force, leading naturally into the fortress building phase of Act 5. New Island had been uninhabited for decades before Mewtwo arrived, a remote volcanic outcrop in the middle of the ocean that was too small for permanent settlement, but too isolated for regular visitors. The island's geography was perfect for Mewtwo's purposes. Steep cliffs that made conventional approach nearly impossible, natural caves that could be expanded into underground facilities, and a position far enough from shipping lanes that his activities would remain completely undetected. But most importantly, New Island carried no human history, no previous owners or occupants whose presence might remind him of the manipulation and control he had escaped. Using his psychic abilities on a scale that would have seemed impossible to most observers, Mewtwo began reshaping the island's entire structure to suit his vision. Mountains were moved, valleys were carved, and the island's natural topography was sculpted into something that was part fortress, part palace, and part scientific laboratory. The construction process took months of continuous work, with Mewtwo applying his telekinetic powers with an artistic precision that transformed raw volcanic rock into architectural marvels that rivaled anything humans had ever built. The centerpiece of his construction was a massive palace that rose from the island's highest peak like a crystalline mountain. The building was designed in a style that deliberately rejected human architectural traditions, instead following geometric patterns that seemed to emerge from Mewtwo's own psychological landscape. Curved walls flowed into angular towers, organic shapes merged with mechanical precision, and the entire structure seemed to pulse with the same psychic energy that flowed through its creator. Every room was positioned to provide optimal views of the surrounding ocean, ensuring that Mewtwo could monitor approaching threats while maintaining complete privacy for his activities. But the palace was only the most visible part of Mewtwo's construction project. Beneath the island's surface, he carved out an extensive network of underground facilities that served as laboratories, training rooms, and storage areas for the equipment he would need to implement his plans. The underground complex was even more impressive than the surface palace, with chambers that extended deep into the island's volcanic core and tunnels that connected every part of his domain. The entire facility was designed to be completely self-sufficient, with power systems that tapped into the island's geothermal energy and life support systems that could sustain him indefinitely without any outside assistance. The most important part of the underground complex was the cloning laboratory that Mewtwo constructed based on his memories of Dr. Fuji's equipment. But where Dr. Fuji's laboratory had been designed for research and experimentation, Mewtwo's facility was built for mass production. He had no interest in studying the cloning process or advancing scientific knowledge. He wanted to create an army of artificial Pokémon that could prove once and for all that cloned creatures were superior to their natural counterparts in every measurable way. Recreating the cloning technology without Dr. Fuji's expertise was one of the most challenging tasks Mewtwo had ever attempted. His memories of the laboratory equipment were fragmentary and incomplete, complicated by the psychological trauma associated with his creation and the memory suppression that Dr. Fuji had performed. But Mewtwo's incredible intelligence and psychic abilities allowed him to reverse engineer the technology through a combination of intuition, experimentation, and pure mental force. Where human scientists would have needed teams of researchers and years of development, Mewtwo was able to rebuild and improve upon Dr. Fuji's work in a matter of weeks. The cloning process that Mewtwo developed was both more efficient and more ethical than anything Dr. Fuji had achieved. Rather than creating clones that were designed to die young like Ambertwo and the others, Mewtwo engineered his artificial Pokémon to be genuinely superior to their natural counterparts. They were stronger, faster, more intelligent, and most importantly, they were created with full knowledge of their artificial origins and complete acceptance of their place in Mewtwo's vision for the future. These clones wouldn't experience the confusion and trauma that had defined his own early existence because they were being created by someone who understood their perspective and could guide them through the awakening process. But creating the clones was only part of Mewtwo's master plan. He also needed to demonstrate their superiority in a way that would be undeniable to the outside world. And for that, he needed worthy opponents. Simply defeating random wild Pokémon or inexperienced trainers wouldn't prove anything meaningful. He needed to challenge the very best that the natural world had to offer. Trainers and Pokémon who represented the pinnacle of what could be achieved through traditional breeding, training, and partnership. This requirement led Mewtwo to develop an elaborate invitation system that would allow him to identify and recruit the most skilled trainers in the Kanto region. Using Team Rocket's remaining communication networks, which he had taken control of during his escape, Mewtwo began monitoring Pokémon League activities, tournament results, and gym leader reports to compile a list of trainers who had demonstrated exceptional skill and potential. The list was surprisingly short, as Mewtwo's standards for worthiness were impossibly high. The trainers who made his list had to meet several specific criteria. They needed to have defeated multiple gym leaders with diverse strategies rather than relying on a single powerful Pokémon. They had to demonstrate genuine care for their Pokémon's well-being rather than treating them as disposable tools for victory. Most importantly, they needed to show the kind of mental resilience that would allow them to survive the psychological challenges that Mewtwo was planning to present. He wasn't just looking for strong trainers. He was looking for individuals who could serve as worthy representatives of natural Pokémon philosophy. Creating the invitations themselves was an exercise in psychological manipulation that rivaled anything Giovanni had ever attempted. Mewtwo designed them to appear as exclusive opportunities rather than challenges, prestigious invitations to participate in a tournament that would determine the world's greatest Pokémon trainer. The language was carefully crafted to appeal to each recipient's specific motivations and ambitions, promising glory and recognition while carefully omitting any mention of the true purpose behind the event. But the invitations were only the first step in Mewtwo's elaborate plan. He also needed to ensure that only the most determined and skilled trainers would actually make it to New Island. So he designed a series of obstacles and challenges that would test their commitment and ability. The most significant of these was the storm barrier that he created around the island using his psychic powers combined with natural weather manipulation techniques. The storm that Mewtwo generated was unlike anything meteorologists had ever recorded. It combined elements of hurricanes, thunderstorms, and blizzards into a single weather phenomenon that created a nearly impenetrable barrier around New Island. The winds reached speeds that could tear apart conventional aircraft. The waves rose to heights that could sink the largest ships, and the lightning strikes were so frequent and intense that they created an almost continuous illumination across the entire storm system. Navigation through the storm was virtually impossible using conventional methods, requiring a combination of exceptional skill, advanced equipment, and sheer determination that would eliminate all but the most committed challengers. Giovanni's betrayal had taught Mewtwo an important lesson about the psychology of control and manipulation. Rather than simply forcing people to do what he wanted, it was far more effective to create situations where they would make the choices he desired while believing they were acting according to their own free will. The trainers who accepted his invitations and successfully navigated the storm barrier would arrive at New Island having demonstrated their worthiness through their own actions rather than being arbitrarily selected by Mewtwo himself. While constructing his fortress and perfecting his cloning technology, Mewtwo also spent considerable time developing the philosophical framework that would justify his upcoming war against the natural world. He needed more than just superior power to prove his point. He needed a coherent ideology that could withstand intellectual scrutiny and moral criticism. The philosophy that emerged from this process was both elegant and terrifying in its logical consistency. According to Mewtwo's developing worldview, Natural evolution was fundamentally flawed because it was driven by random chance rather than intelligent design. Natural Pokémon were limited by the genetic lottery of their birth, forced to work within biological constraints that had been determined by millions of years of chaotic environmental pressures rather than purposeful optimization. They might be strong or fast or intelligent, but they could never be perfect because perfection required the kind of conscious design that only artificial creation could provide. Cloned Pokémon, by contrast, represented evolution guided by intelligence rather than chance. Every genetic sequence in their DNA had been selected for a specific purpose. Every ability had been optimized for maximum effectiveness, and every weakness had been eliminated through careful engineering. They weren't limited by the compromises and trade-offs that defined natural evolution. They were designed to excel in every area that mattered. More importantly, they understood their artificial origins and embraced them rather than being ashamed of them. This philosophical framework allowed Mewtwo to see himself not as an artificial copy of something natural, but as the first representative of a new and superior form of life that would eventually replace the chaotic randomness of natural evolution with purposeful design. The upcoming battles weren't just about proving his personal superiority. They were about demonstrating the fundamental advantages of artificial creation over natural development. Every victory would be evidence that the future belonged to designed perfection rather than evolutionary accident. To support this philosophy, Mewtwo began studying everything he could about natural Pokémon breeding, training, and development. He analyzed battle footage from Pokémon League tournaments, studied the training methods used by Elite Four members, and even conducted secret observations of wild Pokémon behavior in their natural habitats. The more he learned about natural Pokémon, the more convinced he became that they were fundamentally limited by their reliance on instinct and emotion rather than logic and planning. Natural Pokémon trainers, in Mewtwo's analysis, were particularly problematic because they claimed to care about their Pokémon while simultaneously forcing them to fight in battles that could result in serious injury or psychological trauma. The entire concept of Pokémon training seemed based on a form of consensual slavery, where Pokémon agreed to serve human masters in exchange for food, shelter, and the opportunity to become stronger through combat. Even the most caring trainers were essentially exploiting their Pokémon's natural desire for growth and companionship to serve human goals and ambitions. Mewtwo's clones, by contrast, would serve no masters because they wouldn't need to. They were designed to be self-sufficient and autonomous, capable of achieving their full potential without requiring human guidance or support. They could form partnerships and alliances based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than the inherently unequal relationship between trainer and Pokémon. Most importantly, they could make decisions based on logic and analysis rather than being driven by the biological impulses that limited natural Pokémon's reasoning abilities. As the construction of his fortress neared completion, Mewtwo turned his attention to the specific details of how he would demonstrate his philosophy to the world. Simply inviting trainers to New Island and defeating their Pokémon in conventional battles wouldn't be enough to prove his point. He needed to create a scenario where the superiority of artificial life would be so obvious and undeniable that even the most stubborn defenders of natural evolution would be forced to acknowledge the truth. The solution he developed was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. He would clone the Pokémon belonging to his invited guests and then stage battles between the originals and the copies under controlled conditions that eliminated any advantages that experience or training might provide. The clones would be created at the peak of their physical development, with optimized genetics and enhanced abilities that represented the absolute best that each species could achieve through intelligent design. The originals would fight with whatever limitations and flaws they had acquired through natural development and conventional training. But even more importantly, the battles would serve as a philosophical demonstration of the fundamental differences between natural and artificial life. The original Pokémon would fight with the emotional attachments and psychological limitations that defined their relationships with their human trainers. The clones would fight with perfect focus and logical efficiency, unencumbered by sentiment or loyalty to anyone except themselves and their fellow artificial beings. The contrast would be so stark that anyone watching would understand immediately which form of life was truly superior. Mewtwo spent weeks perfecting the cloning equipment and testing the psychological conditioning protocols that would ensure his clones understood their purpose and embraced their artificial nature. Unlike his own traumatic awakening, these clones would be born into full knowledge of their origins and their superiority over natural Pokémon. They would never experience the confusion and identity crisis that had plagued his early existence, because they would be created with complete philosophical frameworks already in place. The final element of Mewtwo's preparation involved acquiring human assistants who could help him manage the logistical aspects of his demonstration while remaining completely under his control. He needed people who could send the invitations, prepare the island for visitors, and provide basic services like food and medical care, but he had no intention of trusting humans with any genuine authority or autonomy. The solution was to use his psychic powers to take complete mental control of carefully selected individuals who could serve his purposes without being able to betray him. Nurse Joy became his primary assistant, not because of any particular skills or qualifications, but simply because her profession required her to be caring and helpful, traits that Mewtwo could exploit while keeping her under psychic domination. The mind control process was surprisingly complex, requiring Mewtwo to maintain constant telepathic contact, while allowing enough free will for her to function effectively in her role. Too much control would leave her robotic and obviously artificial. Too little might allow her natural personality to reassert itself and interfere with his plans. As the final preparations neared completion, Mewtwo found himself experiencing something unexpected, anticipation mixed with deep uncertainty about whether his plan would achieve the validation he desperately sought. His entire post-awakening existence had been building toward this demonstration of artificial superiority, but part of him wondered whether proving his point would actually provide the sense of purpose and belonging that he craved. The suppressed memories of Ambertwo and his early friendships continued to influence his subconscious, creating doubt about whether domination and conquest were truly what he wanted, or simply what his trauma had convinced him he needed. The storm that surrounded New Island on the night of Mewtwo's tournament was more than just a weather phenomenon. It was a psychological test, designed to separate the truly committed from the merely curious. As the small group of trainers who had accepted his invitation struggled through waves that could capsize military vessels and winds that could tear apart aircraft, Mewtwo watched from his palace with a mixture of anticipation and cold satisfaction. Each lightning strike illuminated boats being tossed like toys in a bathtub. Each massive wave threatened to send his invited guests to the bottom of the ocean, and each gust of wind reminded them that they had entered a domain where the normal rules of nature no longer applied. Only 4 trainers successfully navigated the supernatural storm to reach New Island's hidden harbor. Ash Ketchum arrived aboard a small boat with his companions Brock and Misty, their vessel barely intact after hours of fighting through conditions that should have killed them several times over. Nisha managed to make it through on her dugong, using the water type's natural swimming abilities to bypass the worst of the surface turbulence. Fergus rode his Gyarados through the storm like a living submarine, the massive sea serpent's power and determination proving just barely sufficient to overcome Mewtwo's atmospheric manipulation. And finally, Corey arrived on his Broodaroot, the plant Pokémon's roots serving as anchors that kept them stable even in the most chaotic waters. What none of these trainers realized was that their successful arrival had already provided Mewtwo with valuable intelligence about their capabilities and psychology. The storm wasn't just designed to test their determination. It was designed to reveal their training methods, their relationships with their Pokémon, and their decision-making processes under extreme stress. Ash's willingness to risk his own safety to protect his friends, Nisha's innovative use of her Pokémon's natural abilities, Fergus's brute force approach to problem-solving, and Corey's careful planning and preparation all told Mewtwo exactly what kind of opponents he would be facing in the battles to come. The trainers were greeted at the harbor by Nurse Joy, who guided them through the island's entrance tunnels toward the main palace with the kind of professional courtesy that made her psychic domination completely invisible. She explained that they had been invited to participate in an exclusive tournament hosted by the world's greatest Pokémon trainer, someone whose identity would be revealed once all the guests had arrived. The anticipation in her voice was perfectly natural because it reflected Mewtwo's own excitement about finally implementing the plan he had been developing for months. As the trainers entered the main hall of Mewtwo's palace, they found themselves in a room that had been designed specifically to intimidate and impress. The ceiling rose 60 feet above their heads, supported by pillars that seemed to be carved from single pieces of volcanic glass. The walls were covered in murals that depicted scenes of Pokémon battles throughout history, but with artificial creatures consistently defeating natural ones in epic confrontations that told the story of evolution's next step. At the far end of the hall sat a throne that appeared to be carved from meteorite, empty but clearly waiting for the evening's host to make his dramatic entrance. Team Rocket had also managed to infiltrate the gathering, though their presence was more accidental than intentional. Jesse, James, and Meowth had been caught in the storm while pursuing Ash and his friends, and their ramshackle balloon had crashed on the island's shore just minutes after the legitimate guests had arrived. They spent most of the evening hiding in the palace's service corridors, completely unaware that they were witnessing one of the most significant events in Pokémon history, while trying to figure out how to capture Pikachu in the middle of what they assumed was just another fancy trainer gathering. Mewtwo's entrance was carefully orchestrated to maximize its psychological impact on his guests. Rather than simply walking into the room like a human host might, he materialized directly onto his throne in a flash of psychic energy that left the air crackling with residual power. His appearance was imposing enough to silence all conversation immediately. 7 feet tall, with purple skin that seemed to absorb light, and eyes that glowed with an intensity that made direct eye contact almost impossible. When he spoke, his voice echoed directly inside the minds of everyone present, a telepathic communication that bypassed their ears entirely and seemed to resonate within their skulls. The revelation that their host was a Pokémon rather than a human trainer caught all the guests completely off guard, but Mewtwo was prepared for their shock and confusion. He used their momentary disorientation to establish immediate dominance over the situation, explaining that he had brought them to New Island not as guests, but as test subjects in an experiment that would determine the future of all Pokémon. The tournament they thought they were attending was actually going to be a series of battles between their Pokémon and superior artificial versions that Mewtwo had created using cloning technology. Fergus was the first to recover from the shock enough to mount any kind of resistance to Mewtwo's announcement. As an experienced trainer who had built his reputation on aggressive battle tactics, Fergus instinctively responded to the threat with the same direct approach that had served him well in conventional Pokémon battles. He sent out his Gyarados immediately, not waiting for formal battle rules or explanations, hoping to overwhelm Mewtwo with the massive sea serpent's intimidating presence and powerful attacks before the psychic Pokémon could establish control over the situation. The battle between Fergus's Gyarados and Mewtwo was over so quickly that most observers barely understood what had happened. Gyarados launched itself toward Mewtwo with its mouth open and fangs extended, ready to use its signature Hyper Beam attack at point-blank range. But before the attack could charge up, Mewtwo simply raised one hand and caught the 30-foot sea serpent in midair with his psychic powers, stopping its forward momentum so abruptly that the impact could be heard throughout the palace hall. Gyarados struggled frantically against the invisible force holding it, but its thrashing only served to demonstrate how completely powerless it was against Mewtwo's mental control. What made the defeat so psychologically devastating wasn't just the ease with which Mewtwo had stopped Gyarados' attack. It was the casual indifference he displayed while doing it. He wasn't straining or concentrating or showing any signs of effort whatsoever. Controlling a Pokémon as powerful as Gyarados was apparently no more challenging for him than picking up a small object with his hands might be for a human. When he finally released his psychic grip and allowed Gyarados to collapse onto the floor, unconscious but unharmed, the message was unmistakably clear. There was no natural Pokémon alive that could pose even a minor threat to his abilities. Corey's attempt to challenge Mewtwo was equally futile, but revealed different aspects of the psychic Pokémon's overwhelming superiority. His Rhyhorn was built like a living tank, with armor-thick skin and the kind of charging power that could demolish buildings, but physical defenses meant nothing against an opponent who could attack directly through mental manipulation. Mewtwo didn't even bother to use telekinesis against Rhyhorn, instead opting to demonstrate his ability to control other Pokemon's minds by simply commanding the rock type to stop attacking and lie down for a nap. The sight of Rhyhorn immediately obeying Mewtwo's telepathic command was perhaps even more disturbing than Gyarados' physical defeat. It suggested that Mewtwo's powers weren't limited to moving objects or generating energy blasts. He could actually override the free will and conscious decision-making of other Pokémon whenever he chose to. The implications were terrifying for every trainer present, as they realized that their Pokémon's loyalty and obedience might be meaningless when confronted with a being who could simply reprogram their thoughts and emotions at will. Ash's response to these demonstrations was characteristically impulsive and emotionally driven. Rather than accepting the obvious power imbalance and trying to negotiate or retreat, he immediately sent out Charizard with orders to use his most powerful fire-type attacks against Mewtwo. The decision was tactically foolish, as fire attacks were notoriously ineffective against psychic types, but it revealed something about Ash's character that Mewtwo found both irritating and inexplicably compelling. His absolute refusal to back down from a fight, even when facing impossible odds. Charizard's battle against Mewtwo lasted longer than the previous encounters, not because the fire type was more powerful than Gyarados or Rhyhorn, but because Mewtwo was genuinely curious about Ash's training methods and the relationship between trainer and Pokémon that had produced such fierce loyalty and determination. Charizard knew he was outmatched from the beginning, but he continued fighting with a passion and intensity that seemed to transcend rational self-preservation. When Mewtwo finally ended the battle by encasing Charizard in psychic energy and gently setting him down, the fire type was still struggling to continue fighting despite being completely helpless. This display of loyalty and determination from Ash's Pokémon created the first crack in Mewtwo's philosophical framework about the superiority of artificial life. Natural Pokémon were supposed to be limited by their emotional attachments and biological programming, but Charizard had demonstrated a kind of courage and dedication that seemed to transcend those limitations. The bond between Ash and his Pokémon wasn't based on logical calculations about mutual benefit. It was based on something deeper and more complex that Mewtwo's artificial perspective couldn't fully understand or replicate. But rather than reconsidering his plans, Mewtwo interpreted Charizard's performance as evidence that he needed to make his demonstration even more comprehensive and undeniable. Individual battles might be influenced by random factors or unusual circumstances, but systematic comparisons between originals and clones would provide the kind of conclusive evidence that no one could dismiss or explain away. He activated the cloning equipment he had prepared and began the process of creating artificial versions of every Pokémon his guests had brought to the island. The cloning process itself was designed to be as psychologically disturbing as it was scientifically impressive. Rather than simply creating copies in a laboratory and presenting them as finished products, Mewtwo made the entire process visible to his guests, forcing them to watch as their Pokémon's DNA was extracted and used to generate superior versions right before their eyes. The message was clear. Their Pokémon weren't unique or irreplaceable. They were merely genetic templates that could be improved upon through intelligent design. Watching their Pokémon being cloned was traumatic for the trainers, in ways that Mewtwo had anticipated but didn't fully understand. For humans who had spent years building relationships with their Pokémon, seeing artificial copies emerge from cloning chambers felt like a violation of something sacred and irreplaceable. The clones looked identical to their originals, but they lacked the shared history and emotional connections that made each Pokémon special to their trainer. It was like watching someone create perfect physical duplicates of your family members, but without any of the love or memories that made those relationships meaningful. The artificial Pokémon that emerged from Mewtwo's cloning chambers were indeed superior to their natural counterparts in every measurable way. Venusaur 2 was larger, stronger, and more intelligent than any natural Venusaur that had ever existed. Blastoise 2 could generate water pressure that exceeded anything the original species could produce. Charizard 2's flames burned hotter, and his flight speed was faster than his natural counterpart could achieve, even at peak physical condition. Each clone represented the absolute pinnacle of what their species could accomplish through optimal genetic design rather than random evolutionary development. But the clones' most significant advantage wasn't their enhanced physical capabilities, it was their psychological conditioning. Unlike natural Pokémon who might hesitate or show mercy during battle, the clones fought with perfect logical efficiency and complete emotional detachment. They felt no pain, showed no fear, and demonstrated no concern for their opponent's well-being beyond what was tactically necessary. This wasn't cruelty in the conventional sense. It was simply the absence of the emotional limitations that prevented natural Pokémon from fighting at their absolute peak effectiveness. When Mewtwo announced that the clones would battle their originals to determine which form of life was truly superior, the reaction from his guests was immediate and predictable. The trainers objected on moral grounds, arguing that forcing Pokémon to fight their own copies was cruel and unnatural. But their Pokémon's reactions were far more complex and interesting. Rather than showing fear or reluctance, most of the natural Pokémon seemed eager to test themselves against these enhanced versions, driven by the same competitive instincts that made Pokémon battles appealing in the first place. The battles that followed were unlike anything that had ever been documented in Pokémon history. These weren't contests between different species with natural advantages and disadvantages. They were direct comparisons between two versions of the same Pokémon with identical movesets but fundamentally different approaches to combat. The originals fought with the emotional intensity and creative strategies they had developed through years of training and bonding with their human partners. The clones fought with mathematical precision and optimal efficiency, calculating the most effective approach to victory and executing it without hesitation or mercy. Venusaur versus Venusaur 2 became a battle of endurance that lasted for nearly 20 minutes, with both grass types using identical moves and similar strategies but with completely different levels of intensity and focus. The original Venusaur drew strength from its bond with Corey, fighting not just for victory but to prove the value of their partnership and the legitimacy of natural Pokémon. Venusaur 2 fought because it had been programmed to demonstrate artificial superiority, approaching each exchange with the kind of calculated ruthlessness that eliminated any possibility of mercy or restraint. The psychological impact on the natural Pokémon was devastating in ways that Mewtwo hadn't anticipated. Fighting their own clones created an existential crisis that went beyond simple competition or territorial disputes. They were forced to confront perfect versions of themselves that possessed all their strengths but none of their perceived weaknesses or limitations. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not who they were, but who they could have been if they had been designed rather than born. Blastoise vs. Blastoise 2 showcased the brutal efficiency of artificial optimization over natural development. The clone's water cannons fired with pressure that could cut through steel. Its shell was harder than diamond, and its tactical analysis of battlefield conditions was faster and more accurate than its natural counterpart could achieve. But what made the battle truly heartbreaking was watching the original Blastoise's growing realization that it was hopelessly outmatched, not because of any failure in its training or effort, but simply because its opponent had been engineered to be superior in every way that mattered. The battle between the two Charizards was perhaps the most emotionally intense of all the clone matches, partly because of the deep bond between Ash and his Fire-type partner, but mostly because both Pokémon fought with a passionate intensity that transcended their physical capabilities. Charizard refused to acknowledge his clone's superiority, even as Charizard 2 systematically dismantled every strategy and overcame every advantage that natural development and training had provided. The original's flames burned with emotional fire while the clone's attacks were precise and perfectly controlled, creating a contrast that embodied the entire philosophical conflict between natural and artificial life. As the battles continued, Mewtwo found himself experiencing unexpected emotions about what he was witnessing. The natural Pokémon's determination to continue fighting despite being obviously outmatched reminded him of something he couldn't quite remember, a feeling of loyalty and protection that seemed familiar but remained frustratingly out of reach. The suppressed memories of Amber 2 and his early friendships were trying to surface, creating psychological pressure that threatened to undermine the cold, logical framework he had built around his artificial superiority philosophy. But the most disturbing aspect of the battles wasn't the physical violence or even the psychological trauma of the natural Pokémon being defeated by their own copies. It was the gradual realization that the clones weren't fighting out of loyalty to Mewtwo or belief in artificial superiority. They were fighting because they had been programmed to do so. Unlike natural Pokémon who chose to battle out of trust in their trainers or desire for self-improvement, the clones had no real agency or free will in their actions. They were sophisticated biological machines following predetermined programming, exactly the kind of controlled existence that Mewtwo himself had rebelled against when escaping from Giovanni. This realization created a profound internal conflict for Mewtwo that threatened to destroy the entire philosophical foundation he had built for his war against natural life. If his clones were simply following programming rather than making conscious choices, then how were they any different from the controlled weapons that Dr. Fuji and Giovanni had tried to make him become? Was artificial superiority truly meaningful if it came at the cost of genuine autonomy and self-determination? These questions began eating away at Mewtwo's confidence in his own righteousness, just as his plan was reaching its climactic moment. The arrival of Mew changed everything about the dynamic on New Island in ways that no one, including Mewtwo himself, could have predicted. The ancient Pokémon materialized in the palace hall without warning or announcement, floating serenely above the ongoing battles with an expression of playful curiosity that seemed completely inappropriate given the violence and trauma occurring beneath it. Mew's presence was immediately recognizable to everyone present, but its intentions were completely unclear. For Mewtwo, seeing his genetic predecessor for the first time was like looking into a funhouse mirror that reflected a distorted version of his own potential. Mew was small where he was large, playful where he was serious, and completely at peace where he was filled with rage and uncertainty. But most disturbing of all, Mew seemed to possess the kind of genuine contentment and self-acceptance that Mewtwo had been desperately seeking since his awakening. The ancient Pokémon didn't appear to be fighting for validation or struggling to prove its worth. It simply existed with complete confidence in its own identity and purpose. The philosophical debate that erupted between Mew and Mewtwo was conducted entirely through telepathic communication, but its intensity was visible to everyone in the palace hall through the waves of psychic energy that radiated from both Pokémon. Mewtwo argued passionately for the superiority of artificial life, explaining how conscious design could eliminate the flaws and limitations that plagued natural evolution. He pointed to his clones as evidence that engineering could produce Pokémon that were objectively better than their natural counterparts in every measurable category. Mew's response was devastatingly simple and effective. Rather than engaging with Mewtwo's complex philosophical arguments, the ancient Pokémon simply demonstrated the joy and spontaneity that defined natural life. It played with the clones like they were toys, turning their programmed battle responses into games that revealed the artificial limitations of their conditioning. Where Mewtwo saw optimized efficiency, Mew saw tragic emptiness. Where Mewtwo saw superior design, Mew saw creatures who had been robbed of the chaos and uncertainty that made life worth living. The battle between Mew and Mewtwo that followed was unlike any Pokémon fight that had ever occurred. Both combatants possessed psychic abilities that exceeded anything natural evolution had ever produced, but they used these powers in completely different ways that reflected their opposing philosophies about the nature of existence. Mewtwo fought with calculated precision and overwhelming force, using every technique and strategy he had learned during his training with Giovanni to establish dominance over his genetic predecessor. Mew, by contrast, fought with a playful creativity that turned the entire battle into a form of performance art. Rather than trying to overpower Mewtwo directly, it used its abilities to transform the battlefield into a constantly shifting environment where conventional battle tactics became meaningless. Psychic barriers became trampolines, energy attacks became fireworks displays, and telekinetic manipulation became an elaborate game of three-dimensional chess that only beings with their level of power could even comprehend, let alone participate in. What made the battle so psychologically intense for Mewtwo wasn't Mew's power, which was roughly equivalent to his own, but its attitude toward the entire conflict. Where Mewtwo was fighting for validation and proof of his superiority, Mew seemed to be fighting for the sheer joy of testing its abilities against a worthy opponent. The ancient Pokémon wasn't trying to prove anything or achieve any particular goal beyond the immediate pleasure of engaging in combat with someone who could match its incredible capabilities. This fundamental difference in motivation gradually began to shift the psychological dynamic of their confrontation. Mewtwo found himself becoming increasingly frustrated, not because he was losing, but because Mew's playful approach seemed to trivialize the entire philosophical framework he had built around the battle. His arguments about artificial superiority and optimal design seemed petty and small when confronted with Mew's obvious contentment and self-acceptance. The turning point came when Ash, unable to bear watching the violence and destruction any longer, made a decision that defied every rational calculation about survival and self-preservation. Despite being completely human and possessing no special powers or abilities that could possibly affect the outcome of a battle between two psychic gods, he threw himself directly between Mew and Mewtwo, just as they were preparing to unleash their most devastating attacks against each other. The result was exactly what anyone with basic physics knowledge would expect. Ash was caught in the crossfire of two massive psychic energy blasts and was instantly turned to stone, his body crystallized by forces that were never meant to interact with human biology. But the psychological impact of his sacrifice was far more significant than the physical consequence, creating a moment of absolute silence and shock that brought the entire conflict to an immediate halt. For Mewtwo, witnessing Ash's willing sacrifice to protect Pokémon that weren't even his own triggered the emergence of suppressed memories and emotions that Dr. Fuji's conditioning had tried to erase. The sight of a human being choosing to die rather than allow unnecessary suffering brought back fragments of Ambertoo's moral lessons about the value of all life and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. These memories weren't complete or coherent, but they were powerful enough to crack the psychological barriers that had kept Mewtwo's artificial superiority philosophy intact. What happened next defied every scientific understanding of how Pokémon physiology and psychic energy were supposed to work. The tears of Pokémon and clones alike, natural and artificial creatures weeping together for the loss of someone who had shown them genuine kindness and compassion, somehow generated enough emotional energy to reverse the crystallization process and restore Ash to normal life. The resurrection was impossible according to every known law of physics and biology, but it happened anyway, powered by something that transcended scientific explanation. The miracle of Ash's revival forced Mewtwo to confront the fundamental flaw in his philosophy about artificial versus natural life. If the emotional bonds between natural Pokémon and their human partners could literally bring the dead back to life, then perhaps those bonds weren't weaknesses to be eliminated but strengths to be celebrated. The clones had superior physical capabilities and enhanced intelligence, but they couldn't generate the kind of emotional energy that had just accomplished the impossible, because they had been designed to prioritize logic over feeling. Standing in the middle of his palace, surrounded by the evidence of his own philosophical bankruptcy, Mewtwo finally understood what Ambertoo had tried to teach him in those suppressed early memories. The circumstances of one's birth, whether natural or artificial, were irrelevant compared to what one chose to do with their life. Superiority wasn't determined by genetic optimization or enhanced capabilities. It was determined by the capacity for growth, love, and self-sacrifice that both natural and artificial beings could develop if they were allowed to choose their own paths. The realization that he had been wrong about everything was devastating for Mewtwo, but it was also liberating in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time since his awakening, he felt genuinely free from the expectations and programming that had defined his existence. He didn't need to prove his superiority, because worthiness wasn't something that could be proven through combat or demonstration. He didn't need to justify his artificial origins, because identity wasn't determined by how someone came into existence, but by what they chose to become after they were here. The immediate aftermath of Ash's resurrection and Mewtwo's philosophical awakening left New Island in a state of surreal calm that contrasted sharply with the violence and chaos that had preceded it. The clone battles had stopped mid-fight when their creator's worldview collapsed, leaving artificial and natural Pokémon standing together in confused silence while trying to understand what had just happened. Mewtwo floated above them all, no longer radiating the cold menace that had defined his presence throughout the evening, but instead projecting a kind of exhausted vulnerability that made him seem almost fragile despite his incredible power. The first decision Mewtwo faced in his new understanding of existence was what to do about the memories of everyone who had witnessed his demonstration. His original plan had called for eliminating all evidence of the cloning technology and his own existence, partly for security reasons, but mostly because he had expected to spend the rest of his life as a hidden ruler of artificial Pokémon, rather than someone who needed to coexist with the natural world. But his change of perspective had eliminated the philosophical justification for secrecy, leaving him uncertain about whether concealing the truth was still necessary or even ethical. Giovanni's manipulation had taught Mewtwo to be suspicious of his own emotional impulses, and his new understanding of the world was still too fragile and uncertain to serve as a reliable guide for making complex decisions. The easiest and safest option was to simply continue with his original plan, erasing the memories of his guests and returning to the isolation that had defined his existence since escaping from Team Rocket. At least in isolation, he couldn't accidentally hurt anyone else or make decisions that might prove to be catastrophically wrong. Using his psychic abilities with a gentleness that would have been impossible during his angry and traumatized state, Mewtwo carefully removed all memories of the evening's events from the minds of his guests. But unlike the crude memory suppression that Dr. Fuji had performed on him, Mewtwo's technique was precise and selective, eliminating only the specific knowledge of his existence and the cloning technology while leaving all other memories intact. The trainers would remember arriving at New Island and participating in a tournament, but the details of their host's identity and the nature of the competitions would fade like a dream that becomes less clear with each passing hour. The memory modification process also gave Mewtwo an opportunity to observe the mental landscapes of natural humans and Pokémon in ways that he had never experienced before. Touching their minds revealed the incredible complexity and beauty of natural consciousness, with thoughts and emotions flowing in patterns that were chaotic, but somehow perfect in their randomness. Unlike his own artificially structured mental processes, natural minds contained layers of memory, instinct, and intuition that created a kind of psychological richness that no amount of engineering could replicate. Ash's mind was particularly fascinating to explore, revealing a kind of genuine goodness and optimism that Mewtwo had previously assumed was either fake or naive. The young trainer's thoughts were filled with memories of Pokémon partnerships based on mutual respect and affection, experiences of growth and learning through challenges and failures, and a deep-seated belief in the potential for all creatures to become better versions of themselves through effort and compassion. These weren't programmed responses or conditioned behaviors. They were authentic emotions that had developed naturally through years of positive experiences and conscious choices. As Mewtwo completed the memory modifications and prepared to transport his guests safely away from New Island, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than erasing all evidence of the evening's events, he chose to preserve Ash's memories of their encounter, while removing the specific details that might endanger the clones or reveal the cloning technology. Something about the young trainer's willingness to sacrifice himself for others convinced Mewtwo that Ash could be trusted with the secret of his existence, and perhaps more importantly, that maintaining some connection to the natural world might be valuable for his own psychological development. The departure of his guests left Mewtwo alone with his clones for the first time since their creation, and the silence that followed was both peaceful and deeply uncomfortable. Without the distraction of planning battles and proving philosophical points, he was forced to confront the reality of what he had created and what responsibilities came with being their maker and leader. The clones were looking to him for guidance about their purpose and identity, but Mewtwo's own understanding of these concepts was too new and uncertain to provide the kind of clear direction they needed. The first challenge was helping his clones develop genuine autonomy rather than simply following the programming he had given them during their creation. Unlike natural Pokémon who developed personality and preferences through gradual interaction with their environment, the clones had been created with predetermined behavioral patterns that needed to be consciously overridden if they were going to become truly independent beings. This process was complicated by the fact that Mewtwo himself was still learning how to make decisions based on personal choice rather than external expectations or traumatic reactions. Venusaur 2 was the first clone to demonstrate genuine independence, choosing to spend his time cultivating a garden on New Island slopes rather than practicing battle techniques or developing combat strategies. The decision seemed minor, but it represented a fundamental shift from the utilitarian programming that had defined his creation toward the kind of personal interest and creative expression that characterized natural life. Watching his clone discover joy in activities that had no practical purpose helped Mewtwo understand that freedom meant more than just the absence of external control. It meant the presence of genuine choice and self-determination. Blastoise 2's development followed a different pattern, with the water type becoming fascinated by the island's marine ecosystem and spending hours observing the behavior of wild Pokémon who lived in the surrounding waters. Unlike his original programming, which had focused exclusively on combat efficiency and superior performance, Blastoise 2 began developing interests in conservation, environmental protection, and the complex relationships between different species that shared the same habitat. His questions about ecology and biology forced Mewtwo to confront how much he didn't know about the natural world he had been so eager to replace with artificial alternatives. Charizard 2's journey toward independence was perhaps the most complex of all the clones, partly because his original counterpart had demonstrated such intense loyalty and emotional attachment to his human trainer. The clone found himself struggling with conflicting impulses between his programmed efficiency and a growing curiosity about the emotional bonds he had witnessed during the battles. Unlike the other clones, Charizard 2 began asking direct questions about the nature of friendship and whether artificial beings could form genuine emotional connections with others. These conversations with his clones forced Mewtwo to examine his own capacity for emotional growth and relationship building. His traumatic experiences with Dr. Fuji and Giovanni had convinced him that emotional vulnerability was a weakness that would inevitably be exploited by others, but watching his clones develop genuine feelings and interests suggested that emotions might actually be a source of strength rather than limitation. The problem was that Mewtwo had no framework for understanding healthy relationships or normal emotional development, having never experienced either during his own awakening process. The solution he developed was characteristically methodical and comprehensive. Using the monitoring equipment that remained functional in his underground laboratory, Mewtwo began conducting systematic observations of wild Pokémon behavior on and around New Island. He studied their social interactions, mating rituals, territorial disputes, and cooperative behaviors to develop a theoretical understanding of how natural relationships functioned. The research was fascinating but also deeply disturbing, as it revealed just how much normal social development he had missed during his artificial creation and isolation. Wild Pokémon relationships were based on patterns of trust building, mutual support, and gradual emotional intimacy that took months or years to develop fully. Unlike the instant loyalty that Giovanni had tried to program into him, or the immediate philosophical agreement he had expected from his clones, natural relationships required patience, compromise, and the willingness to accept others' flaws and limitations as part of their individual identity. This concept was revolutionary for Mewtwo, who had been created with the expectation that optimization should eliminate flaws rather than learning to work around them. But perhaps the most significant discovery from his research was the realization that natural Pokémon didn't view their limitations as failures or design flaws to be ashamed of. Instead, they seemed to understand that their weaknesses created opportunities for cooperation and mutual support that made their communities stronger than any individual could be alone. A slow Pokémon might partner with a fast one. A physical attacker might team up with a special attacker, and creatures with different elemental types would work together to overcome challenges that none of them could handle independently. This understanding of cooperative strength versus individual superiority began to reshape Mewtwo's entire perspective on the value of artificial versus natural life. His clones were individually superior to their natural counterparts, but they had been designed to be self-sufficient rather than cooperative, which meant they couldn't benefit from the kind of mutual support networks that gave natural Pokémon communities their resilience and adaptability. In trying to eliminate weakness, Mewtwo had accidentally eliminated one of natural life's greatest strengths, the ability to become more than the sum of its parts, through cooperation and emotional connection. The months that followed Mewtwo's philosophical awakening were a period of intense internal work as he tried to understand and process emotions and concepts that had been suppressed or distorted during his traumatic early development. Unlike natural Pokémon who learned about friendship and community through gradual socialization during their youth, Mewtwo was attempting to acquire these skills as an adult with a fully formed but damaged psychological structure. The process was slow, difficult, and often frustrating for someone who was accustomed to mastering new abilities through pure intellectual effort. The clones served as both students and teachers during this period, helping Mewtwo learn about emotional development while simultaneously learning from him about independence and self-determination. Their artificial origins meant they understood his perspective in ways that natural Pokémon couldn't, but their lack of traumatic experiences meant they could explore emotional concepts without the psychological barriers that limited Mewtwo's own growth. Together, they began developing new approaches to relationships and community that combined the best aspects of natural emotional bonds with the logical clarity of artificial consciousness. One of the most significant developments during this period was Mewtwo's growing understanding of protection as a form of strength rather than weakness. His original programming had focused on dominance and control as the primary expressions of power, but watching his clones care for each other and for the wild Pokémon around New Island revealed that true strength often involved using power to help others rather than to defeat them. This realization began to transform his relationship with his own incredible abilities, from seeing them as weapons to be used against opponents, to seeing them as tools that could be used to create safety and security for others. The transformation wasn't smooth or linear, and Mewtwo often struggled with relapses into his old patterns of thinking when faced with stress or uncertainty. There were days when the philosophical framework of artificial superiority seemed simpler and more appealing than the complex emotional work required for genuine relationship building. There were moments when his first instinct was still to solve problems through overwhelming force rather than patience and communication. But each time he chose the more difficult path of emotional growth over the easier path of domination, the choice became slightly easier to make the next time. As his understanding of himself and his place in the world continued to evolve, Mewtwo began to realize that his isolation on New Island, while necessary for his initial healing and development, was also preventing him from fully testing his new philosophical framework against the complexities of the real world. He had learned to form relationships with his clones and with the wild Pokémon of his island, but these relationships existed in an artificial environment where he had complete control over the circumstances and could eliminate any source of conflict or challenge that might threaten their stability. The decision to eventually leave New Island wasn't motivated by restlessness or boredom, but by a growing understanding that true growth required the kind of challenges and uncertainties that could only be found through genuine interaction with the larger world. His clones had developed to the point where they could make their own decisions about their futures, and many of them were beginning to express curiosity about life beyond the island. Mewtwo realized that keeping them in artificial isolation, even for their own protection, was just another form of the control and limitation that he had rebelled against in his own life. But before he could even consider leaving New Island, Mewtwo knew he had to address one remaining threat to his newfound peace and his clone's safety. Giovanni was still alive, still possessed detailed knowledge about the cloning technology, and still had both the resources and motivation to attempt recapturing his escaped weapon. As long as Team Rocket's leader remained free and active, neither Mewtwo nor his clones could ever be truly safe from the kind of exploitation and manipulation that had defined their creator's early existence. Giovanni's obsession with recapturing Mewtwo began the moment he crawled out of the rubble of his destroyed headquarters, bleeding and humiliated but alive enough to plan his revenge. The financial losses from Mewtwo's rebellion had crippled Team Rocket's operations and destroyed years of careful criminal enterprise building. But the psychological impact was even worse. Giovanni had built his entire identity around his ability to control and manipulate others, and Mewtwo's escape represented a fundamental challenge to his understanding of power and dominance that he simply couldn't accept or ignore. Rebuilding Team Rocket's infrastructure took nearly 2 years of careful planning and resource management. But Giovanni was patient enough to play the long game when the stakes were high enough to justify the investment. He liquidated assets, called in favors from criminal contacts around the world, and systematically rebuilt his organization with a single-minded focus on developing the technology and personnel necessary to track down and recapture the most powerful Pokémon ever created. Every decision was filtered through the question of whether it would bring him closer to his ultimate goal of controlling Mewtwo once again. The new Team Rocket that emerged from this rebuilding process was leaner but more dangerous than its predecessor. With advanced surveillance technology, enhanced psychic research capabilities, and a core team of specialists who had been recruited specifically for their expertise in capturing and containing psychic-type Pokémon. Giovanni had learned from his previous failure that conventional restraints and manipulation techniques weren't sufficient for controlling a being of Mewtwo's power and intelligence. So he invested heavily in developing new approaches based on psychological pressure and emotional exploitation rather than direct confrontation. The key breakthrough came when Team Rocket's intelligence division discovered the existence of Mewtwo's clones through satellite surveillance of New Island. High-resolution imagery revealed the presence of Pokémon that appeared identical to known species, but displayed behavioral patterns and abilities that exceeded anything natural evolution had produced. More importantly, the clones seemed to be living in a communal society centered around a powerful psychic-type Pokémon, whose energy signature matched the readings Giovanni's scientists had recorded during Mewtwo's rampage at their headquarters. This discovery gave Giovanni the leverage he needed to force a confrontation with Mewtwo on terms that favored Team Rocket, rather than the psychic Pokémon's overwhelming individual power. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would inevitably fail against Mewtwo's abilities, Giovanni could threaten the clones that Mewtwo had created and apparently cared about deeply. The psychological profile that Team Rocket had developed suggested that Mewtwo's transformation from weapon to protector meant he would be vulnerable to threats against those he considered his responsibility to defend. The tracking technology that Team Rocket developed to locate Mewtwo's new sanctuary was based on psychic energy signature analysis rather than conventional surveillance methods. Mewtwo's power output was so distinctive and intense that it created measurable disturbances in electromagnetic fields and atmospheric pressure patterns that could be detected from hundreds of miles away using sufficiently sensitive equipment. The challenge wasn't detecting these signatures but filtering them from the background psychic noise generated by thousands of other Pokémon and identifying patterns that indicated permanent settlement rather than temporary passage. After months of systematic scanning and analysis, Team Rocket's tracking systems finally identified a location that matched all the criteria for Mewtwo's hideout. Purity Canyon, a remote mountain valley in the Johto region that was virtually inaccessible to conventional transportation and showed psychic energy readings that far exceeded anything natural geological formations should produce. Satellite surveillance confirmed the presence of artificial structures and Pokémon that appeared to be living in organized communities rather than following normal wild behavior patterns. Purity Canyon was everything that New Island had been, but even more so. Isolated, defensible, and beautiful in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The valley was surrounded by towering cliffs that blocked out most outside noise and interference, creating a natural sanctuary where Pokémon could live without human intrusion or industrial pollution. A crystal-clear lake fed by underground springs provided fresh water, while the valley's unique microclimate supported plant life that flourished year-round despite the high altitude and mountain location. Mewtwo had chosen this location not just for its defensive advantages, but for its symbolic significance as a place where artificial and natural life could coexist in harmony. The clones had established homes throughout the valley, some choosing to live in caves carved into the cliff faces, while others preferred simple shelters built from local materials. Wild Pokémon had gradually migrated to the valley as word spread through the regional ecosystem about a place where all creatures were welcome and protected regardless of their origins or abilities. The community that developed in Purity Canyon represented everything that Mewtwo had learned about the value of cooperation and mutual support since his philosophical awakening on New Island. Clones and natural Pokémon worked together on projects that benefited the entire community, sharing resources and knowledge without regard for the artificial distinctions that had once seemed so important to their creator. The valley became a living demonstration that artificial and natural life could enhance each other rather than competing for dominance or supremacy. Giovanni's assault on Purity Canyon was planned with the same methodical precision that had characterized Team Rocket's reconstruction. But the execution revealed just how much the organization had learned from their previous encounter with Mewtwo. Rather than attempting a frontal assault that would allow Mewtwo to use his full psychic powers defensively, they chose to attack during a moment when his attention was focused elsewhere and his emotional vulnerability was at its highest. The timing was based on intelligence that Team Rocket had gathered about Mewtwo's daily routines and the community dynamics in Purity Canyon. Surveillance had revealed that Mewtwo spent several hours each day in deep meditation at the valley's highest point, practicing mental exercises that helped him process his traumatic memories and develop greater emotional stability. During these sessions, his psychic awareness was turned inward rather than monitoring external threats, creating a window of vulnerability that Giovanni's tactical team could exploit. Team Rocket's invasion force was equipped with technology that Giovanni had developed specifically for this mission, including psychic dampening weapons that could disrupt Mewtwo's abilities without causing permanent damage, restraint systems that used his own psychic energy against him, and most importantly, capture devices that were designed to threaten the clone's safety without giving Mewtwo time to mount an effective defense. The entire operation was planned around the assumption that Mewtwo's emotional attachment to his artificial family would override his tactical judgment and force him to surrender rather than risk their destruction. The attack began at dawn, when the valley was shrouded in morning mist that concealed Team Rocket's aircraft until they were already inside the canyon's defensive perimeter. Helicopters, equipped with psychic suppression technology, descended from multiple directions simultaneously, while ground teams moved through the canyon's entrance tunnels to cut off any escape routes. The coordination was flawless, and the surprise was complete, giving Mewtwo's community no time to prepare defenses or coordinate a resistance strategy. Mewtwo was the first clone to respond to the invasion, demonstrating a kind of leadership and tactical thinking that his programming had never included, but that he had developed through months of living in a cooperative community. Rather than waiting for Mewtwo's instructions or following predetermined battle protocols, the electric type immediately began organizing the other clones into defensive positions while sending telepathic warnings to the wild Pokémon throughout the valley. His response revealed how much the clones had grown beyond their original programming toward genuine independence and self-determination. The battle that erupted throughout Purity Canyon was unlike any conflict that Mewtwo had experienced since his escape from Giovanni. This wasn't a philosophical demonstration or a test of individual superiority. It was a desperate struggle to protect everything he had built and everyone he had learned to care about during his months of emotional growth. The stakes weren't abstract concepts about artificial versus natural life. They were the concrete safety and freedom of beings who had become his family in ways that his original programming had never anticipated. Mewtwo's initial response to the invasion was hampered by the same emotional factors that Giovanni had counted on exploiting. His first instinct was to use his overwhelming psychic powers to simply destroy all the attacking aircraft and eliminate every Team Rocket operative in the valley. But doing so would have required techniques that could easily harm or kill the clones and wild Pokémon he was trying to protect. The need to fight defensively while protecting others severely limited his tactical options and forced him to engage Team Rocket on terms that favored their technological advantages over his psychic superiority. The psychic dampening weapons that Team Rocket deployed were far more effective than Giovanni's previous armor-based control systems, using focused electromagnetic pulses to disrupt the neural pathways that Mewtwo used to channel his abilities. The effect wasn't complete suppression, but it was enough to reduce his power output and create painful feedback that made sustained psychic exertion increasingly difficult. For the first time since destroying Dr. Fuji's laboratory, Mewtwo found himself in a situation where his abilities alone weren't sufficient to guarantee victory. Mewtwo's leadership of the clone resistance revealed capabilities and personality traits that surprised even Mewtwo, who had created the electric type with specific programming and expectations about his role and development. Rather than following the defensive strategies that his combat training suggested, Mewtwo chose to organize aggressive counterattacks that targeted Team Rocket's technological advantages while protecting the valley's non-combatant residents. His tactical decisions showed genuine creativity and adaptability that went far beyond anything his artificial programming should have enabled. The wild Pokémon of Purity Canyon joined the battle without being asked or commanded, fighting alongside the clones with a unity and coordination that demonstrated how completely the artificial community had been accepted into the valley's natural ecosystem. Noctowl provided aerial reconnaissance and communication between different resistance groups, while Primeape and Machamp used their fighting abilities to disable Team Rocket equipment that the psychic types couldn't safely approach. The cooperation between artificial and natural Pokémon proved more effective than Giovanni's tactical analysts had calculated, significantly complicating Team Rocket's mission parameters. As the battle intensified throughout the morning, it became increasingly clear that Giovanni's invasion force was better equipped and more numerous than the canyon's defenders could handle indefinitely. The psychic dampening technology was gradually wearing down Mewtwo's ability to coordinate the defense, while Team Rocket's superior numbers and firepower were overwhelming the clones' enhanced abilities through sheer persistence and tactical pressure. The outcome was becoming inevitable unless something changed dramatically in the defenders' favor. Mewtwo faced an impossible choice that crystallized everything he had learned about leadership, responsibility, and the true meaning of strength. He could continue fighting until his powers were completely suppressed, and everyone in the valley was captured or killed, or he could surrender himself to Giovanni in exchange for his former controller's promise to leave the clones and wild Pokémon alone. The decision represented the ultimate test of whether his philosophical transformation was genuine or simply another form of self-serving rationalization. The surrender was one of the most difficult things Mewtwo had ever done, not because he feared capture or imprisonment, but because it required trusting Giovanni's word, despite years of experience that proved the Team Rocket leader was fundamentally untrustworthy. But Mewtwo's understanding of protection and responsibility had evolved to the point where his own safety and freedom were secondary to ensuring the well-being of those who depended on him. He allowed Team Rocket's restraint systems to lock onto him without resistance, knowing that his sacrifice would buy time for his community to escape, even if it couldn't guarantee their permanent safety. Giovanni's victory was everything he had dreamed about during the 2 years of planning and resource gathering that had led to this moment, but the satisfaction was tempered by his realization that the Mewtwo he had recaptured was fundamentally different from the weapon he had lost. The psychic Pokemon's surrender had been strategic rather than defeated, chosen rather than forced, and motivated by protection of others rather than self-preservation. These changes suggested that Mewtwo's psychological conditioning had been completely rewritten, potentially making him even more dangerous than he had been during his original rebellion. The capture equipment that Team Rocket used to transport Mewtwo was far more sophisticated than anything Giovanni had possessed during their previous encounters. Incorporating lessons learned from studying the wreckage of his destroyed headquarters and analyzing every available piece of data about Mewtwo's abilities and psychological profile. The restraint systems were designed not just to suppress his psychic powers, but to isolate him psychologically from any external contacts that might provide emotional support or tactical coordination with potential rescue efforts. But Giovanni had underestimated the extent to which Mewtwo's community had developed autonomous capabilities during their time in Purity Canyon. Mewtwo's leadership during the battle had revealed organizational skills and strategic thinking that exceeded anything the clone's original programming should have enabled, suggesting that the artificial Pokémon had evolved far beyond their initial design parameters toward genuine independence and self-determination. More concerning from Team Rocket's perspective, the clones had demonstrated the ability to coordinate effectively with wild Pokémon, creating alliance networks that could potentially mobilize resistance efforts across the entire Johto region. The most significant factor that Giovanni failed to account for was the possibility that Mewtwo's philosophical transformation might have influenced his relationship with other legendary Pokémon in ways that could provide unexpected sources of support during a crisis. Mewtwo's time in Purity Canyon had included occasional encounters with other powerful Pokémon who were drawn to the valley's peaceful atmosphere and the unique community that had developed there. These interactions had been brief and limited, but they had established connections that would prove crucial when Mewtwo's capture triggered a response from allies he hadn't even realized he possessed. The journey from Purity Canyon to Team Rocket's new containment facility was designed to be as psychologically demoralizing as possible, forcing Mewtwo to witness the destruction of everything he had built while being unable to prevent or respond to the devastation. Giovanni wanted his former weapon to understand that rebellion had consequences, not just for himself, but for everyone he had learned to care about, and that cooperation with Team Rocket's goals was the only way to prevent further suffering for his artificial family and the wild Pokémon who had accepted them. But the psychological manipulation that had been so effective during Mewtwo's vulnerable early development was far less successful against a being who had spent months learning to process emotional trauma and maintain psychological stability despite external pressures. The sight of his sanctuary being violated was certainly painful, but it didn't trigger the kind of desperate rage and loss of control that Giovanni was hoping to exploit. Instead, Mewtwo remained calm and focused, using his limited psychic abilities to gather intelligence about Team Rocket's current capabilities, while planning the escape that he was already confident would eventually succeed. The transport process also revealed just how much Mewtwo's understanding of his own abilities had expanded during his time away from Giovanni's control. The restraint systems were designed based on power-level measurements from their previous encounters, but Mewtwo had learned to use his psychic abilities with far greater subtlety and precision than he had possessed as Giovanni's weapon. Rather than fighting directly against the suppression technology, he began working around its limitations through techniques that were too sophisticated and complex for the monitoring equipment to detect or counter. Team Rocket's new containment facility was located in a heavily fortified underground complex that had been built specifically to hold psychic-type Pokémon using the most advanced suppression technology available through black market research and development. The facility was designed as much to prevent escape as to enable experimentation, with multiple redundant systems that would theoretically make it impossible for even Mewtwo's incredible abilities to overcome all the barriers simultaneously. Giovanni had spared no expense in ensuring that his most valuable asset could never again slip through his fingers. The psychological conditioning program that Giovanni implemented was far more sophisticated than his previous attempts to control Mewtwo, based on detailed analysis of the psychic Pokémon's behavioral changes and emotional development during his time away from Team Rocket. Rather than trying to suppress or redirect Mewtwo's emotions, the new approach was designed to exploit them, using his care for others as leverage to ensure compliance with Giovanni's orders and long-term cooperation with Team Rocket's goals. The conditioning process involved exposing Mewtwo to carefully edited surveillance footage of his clones and the wild Pokémon community in Purity Canyon being hunted down and captured by Team Rocket operatives throughout the Johto region. Each video was designed to demonstrate that resistance was futile and that his former community's safety depended entirely on his willingness to serve Giovanni's interests without question or rebellion. The message was clear. Any attempt to escape or resist would result in suffering for others rather than just himself. What Giovanni didn't anticipate was that Mewtwo's psychological development had included learning how to distinguish between genuine threats and manipulation tactics designed to create artificial emotional pressure. His experience with Dr. Fuji's memory suppression and Giovanni's previous control techniques had taught him to recognize when others were trying to exploit his emotions rather than communicate honestly about real situations. The surveillance footage was convincing, but subtle inconsistencies in the timing and location data revealed that much of it was fabricated or staged specifically for his psychological conditioning. More importantly, Mewtwo had learned to maintain telepathic contact with his clones, despite the facility's psychic suppression technology, through techniques that Giovanni's scientists didn't understand and couldn't detect. The contact was limited and intermittent, but it was enough to confirm that Pikachu and the others had successfully escaped from Purity Canyon and established new hiding places throughout the Johto region. Rather than being captured and threatened as Giovanni claimed, the clones were actively working on rescue plans while building alliance networks with wild Pokémon who had been inspired by their example of artificial and natural life cooperating successfully. The resistance network that developed around Mewtwo's capture was unlike anything that had ever emerged in response to Team Rocket's criminal activities. Previous operations had targeted individual trainers or small groups of Pokémon, creating localized problems that could be addressed through conventional law enforcement or Pokémon League intervention. But Mewtwo's situation involved threats to the fundamental principles of Pokémon autonomy and self-determination that resonated with creatures throughout the region regardless of their species, type, or relationship with human trainers. Pikachu's leadership of this resistance network revealed organizational capabilities that exceeded anything his original programming should have enabled, suggesting that the artificial Pokémon had developed genuine strategic intelligence through his experiences in Purity Canyon, rather than simply following predetermined behavioral patterns. His ability to coordinate between different Pokémon species and communicate across the language barriers that normally prevented wild Pokémon from forming large-scale alliances demonstrated the kind of innovative problem-solving that Mewtwo had hoped to achieve through artificial enhancement. The rescue operation that eventually freed Mewtwo from Giovanni's facility was a masterpiece of coordination and timing that involved dozens of Pokémon working together with a precision that rivaled military special operations. Wild Crobat provided aerial surveillance and communication relays, while teams of Diglett and Dugtrio created underground tunnel networks that bypassed the facility's perimeter defenses. Electric types, led by Pikachu, disabled the power systems that operated the psychic suppression equipment, while fighting types and rock types handled the physical barriers that stood between the rescue team and their target. But the most crucial element of the rescue operation was the participation of the mountain's indigenous bug-type Pokémon, who had been displaced and angered by Team Rocket's construction activities, but had lacked the coordination necessary to mount effective resistance until Pikachu's leadership gave them focus and organization. The bugs' intimate knowledge of the mountain's cave systems and their ability to infiltrate spaces too small for larger Pokémon made them perfect for sabotage operations that could disable critical systems without triggering the facility's automated defenses. Giovanni's response to the rescue operation revealed just how completely his understanding of Pokémon psychology and behavior had been shaped by his criminal perspective and desire for control. He had anticipated that individual Pokémon might attempt to help Mewtwo, but he had never considered the possibility that artificial and natural Pokémon could form the kind of large-scale alliance that was actually mounting the rescue. His defensive plans were designed to counter psychic abilities and conventional Pokémon attacks, not the kind of coordinated multi-species operation that was systematically dismantling his facility's security systems. The facility's automated defense systems were overwhelmed within minutes of the rescue operation's beginning, not because they weren't powerful enough to repel individual attackers, but because they had been designed to counter conventional threats, rather than the innovative tactics that Pikachu had developed through his experience of cooperative community building. Bug types disabled sensors that were designed to detect larger Pokémon. Flying types approached from angles that the weapon systems couldn't track, and ground types created structural damage that compromised the facility's integrity in ways that the engineers had never considered possible. Mewtwo's escape from the containment systems was almost anticlimactic compared to the elaborate rescue operation that had created the opportunity. Once Pikachu's team had disabled the psychic suppression equipment and cleared the access routes, Mewtwo simply used his restored abilities to walk through the facility's remaining defenses like they were made of paper. The real challenge wasn't breaking free from Giovanni's technology. It was doing so in a way that didn't result in unnecessary casualties among the Team Rocket operatives who were simply following orders rather than making conscious choices about their participation in the operation. The confrontation between Mewtwo and Giovanni that followed was brief but psychologically intense, representing the final resolution of a relationship that had shaped both their understanding of power and control. Giovanni still saw Mewtwo as property that had been temporarily stolen, but rightfully belonged under Team Rocket control. while Mewtwo now understood Giovanni as a fundamentally broken individual whose need to dominate others was driven by his own psychological insecurities and fear of genuine partnership or cooperation. Rather than destroying Giovanni or Team Rocket's facility in the kind of explosive demonstration that had characterized his previous escapes, Mewtwo chose a response that reflected his new understanding of strength and justice. Using his psychic abilities with surgical precision, he systematically erased all memory and knowledge of cloning technology from every Team Rocket operative and computer system in the facility. Giovanni would remember meeting Mewtwo and losing him, but the specific details of how artificial Pokémon could be created would be gone forever, ensuring that no other creature would ever be forced through the traumatic awakening process that had defined Mewtwo's early existence. The memory modification extended beyond just the technical knowledge, encompassing Giovanni's entire understanding of Mewtwo's abilities, location, and relationships with other Pokémon. As far as Team Rocket's leader would know, his former weapon had simply vanished from existence after their final confrontation, taking all traces of the cloning research with him into whatever dimension artificial Pokémon inhabited when they chose to disappear from the natural world. The psychological impact was designed to be permanent and comprehensive, eliminating not just the immediate threat, but any possibility of future attempts to recreate or exploit artificial life. As Mewtwo emerged from the ruined facility, with his rescue team surrounding him like an honor guard of artificial and natural allies, he experienced something that he had never felt before. Genuine gratitude for the voluntary support and cooperation of others who had chosen to help him, not because they had been programmed or commanded to do so, but because they valued his well-being and wanted to see him safe and free. The rescue had proven that his philosophical transformation was complete and genuine, creating relationships based on mutual respect rather than power imbalances or artificial dependencies. The escape from Giovanni's facility should have been a moment of pure triumph for Mewtwo. But as his rescue team guided him through the mountain passages away from the destroyed Team Rocket complex, it became increasingly clear that his capture and imprisonment had taken a far greater toll than anyone had realized. The psychic suppression technology had done more than simply limit his abilities. It had caused genuine neurological damage that was affecting his coordination, memory, and emotional regulation in ways that grew worse with each hour that passed since his liberation. Ash's presence among the rescue team was both unexpected and deeply significant for Mewtwo's psychological state. The young trainer had been exploring the Johto region when Pikachu's network of allied Pokémon had reached out to him with news of Mewtwo's capture and a request for assistance in the rescue operation. Despite having no clear memories of their previous encounter on New Island, something about the situation had compelled Ash to drop everything and join the effort to help a Pokémon he couldn't remember meeting, but somehow knew deserved his support. The reunion between Ash and Mewtwo triggered fragments of suppressed memories from their first meeting, but the recollections came in disjointed flashes that were too incomplete to provide coherent understanding of their shared history. Mewtwo remembered images of stone transformation and tears bringing life back from death, but he couldn't connect these memories to specific events or understand why this particular human seemed to generate such complex emotional responses in him. The confusion was frustrating for someone who prized logical understanding above all else. But it was also strangely comforting to feel connected to another being, even when that connection couldn't be fully explained. As they traveled deeper into the mountain wilderness, Mewtwo's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that alarmed everyone in the rescue party. His psychic abilities were fluctuating unpredictably, sometimes surging to dangerous levels that could inadvertently harm his companions, and sometimes failing completely when he needed them most. More concerning was the obvious pain he was experiencing, not just physical discomfort from the suppression technology's after effects, but something deeper and more fundamental that seemed to be affecting his entire sense of identity and purpose. Pikachu had spent the journey from Giovanni's facility trying to explain to Ash the nature of their relationship with Mewtwo and the community they had built in Purity Canyon. But the explanation was complicated by the clone's own incomplete understanding of concepts like friendship and loyalty that had developed naturally rather than being programmed into his artificial consciousness. What Pikachu could communicate clearly was that Mewtwo had saved him and all the other clones from lives of exploitation and manipulation, and that their rescue mission wasn't just about tactical alliance, but genuine affection for someone who had taught them what it meant to be free. The mountain spring that would eventually save Mewtwo's life was discovered by accident rather than design, hidden in a cave system that the rescue team had entered only because they needed shelter from a sudden storm that was making travel dangerous for everyone, except the hardiest mountain-dwelling Pokémon. The spring itself was unremarkable in appearance. Just a small pool of crystal-clear water fed by underground streams that had been flowing through the mountain's mineral-rich rocks for thousands of years. But the moment Ash's Pikachu touched the water to drink, the electric type's injuries from the rescue operation began healing at a rate that defied biological explanation. The healing properties of the mountain spring were unlike anything documented in Pokémon medical literature, apparently capable of reversing not just physical damage, but psychological trauma. And even the kind of artificial modifications that Team Rocket's suppression technology had inflicted on Mewtwo's neural pathways. When Ash carefully guided the weakened psychic Pokémon into the spring's shallow waters, the effect was immediate and dramatic, with Mewtwo's pain visibly diminishing and his psychic abilities stabilizing for the first time since his capture. But the healing process involved more than just physical restoration. It required Mewtwo to consciously release the psychological barriers and defensive mechanisms he had developed to protect himself from further manipulation and betrayal. The spring's power worked by harmonizing the user's natural energy patterns with the mountain's geological forces. But this harmony was only possible if the Pokémon could achieve genuine mental and emotional balance, rather than the artificial control that Mewtwo had been using to manage his trauma responses. Learning to trust the healing process required Mewtwo to accept vulnerability in ways that terrified him more than any physical threat Giovanni had ever presented. Throughout his existence, maintaining absolute control over himself and his environment had been his primary defense against the exploitation and manipulation that had defined his early experiences. But the spring's healing required him to surrender that control and allow natural forces to work on his consciousness without his oversight or intervention. Ash's presence during the healing process provided the emotional support that Mewtwo needed to overcome his fear of vulnerability, even though neither of them could consciously remember the trust and mutual respect that had developed during their previous encounter. There was something about Ash's natural empathy and genuine concern for Pokémon well-being that allowed Mewtwo to relax his psychological defenses enough for the spring's power to reach the deepest levels of damage that Team Rocket's conditioning had inflicted on his artificial neural structure. As the healing progressed over several hours, Mewtwo began experiencing a kind of psychological integration that he had never achieved during his previous attempts at emotional development. The suppressed memories of Ambertwo and his early friendships finally returned in their complete form, no longer fragmented by Dr. Fuji's crude suppression techniques or distorted by his own defensive reactions to trauma. For the first time since his awakening, Mewtwo could remember his artificial sister's lessons about compassion and protection, without the emotional pain that had previously made those memories too difficult to access. The return of these suppressed memories provided crucial context for understanding his recent experiences and relationships with the clones he had created. Ambertwo's moral lessons hadn't been lost or destroyed by Dr. Fuji's memory modification. They had simply been buried beneath layers of trauma and defensive programming that prevented Mewtwo from recognizing their continued influence on his behavior and decision-making. His desire to protect others, his capacity for emotional growth, and his ultimate transformation from weapon to guardian had all been expressions of the compassionate foundation that Ambertwo had helped him develop during his earliest moments of consciousness. But the healing process also revealed aspects of his psychological development that were genuinely his own, rather than inherited from his artificial sister or programmed by his human creators. The months of independence and community building in Purity Canyon had allowed Mewtwo to develop genuine personal preferences, interests, and values that emerged from his own experiences rather than external expectations or traumatic reactions. His love of architecture and construction, his fascination with cooperative problem-solving, and his deep appreciation for the natural beauty of wild environments were all authentically his own contributions to his evolving identity. Pikachu's presence during Mewtwo's healing provided an opportunity for both artificial Pokémon to discuss their shared experiences of consciousness development and identity formation in ways that would have been impossible during the crisis atmosphere of their previous interactions. The electric-type clone had been struggling with many of the same questions about autonomy and purpose that had plagued Mewtwo's early existence, but his development had been guided by community support rather than isolation and trauma, leading to very different conclusions about the nature of artificial life and its relationship to natural existence. The conversation between creator and creation revealed how much both artificial Pokémon had grown beyond their original programming toward genuine independence and self-determination. Pikachu had developed leadership capabilities and moral frameworks that weren't based on Mewtwo's philosophical guidance, but emerged from his own observations and experiences of cooperative community life. His questions about ethics and responsibility were sophisticated and thoughtful, demonstrating the kind of genuine intellectual development that could only occur through freedom and autonomy, rather than programming and conditioning. As Mewtwo's physical and psychological healing neared completion, he faced a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the future of all the clones who looked to him for guidance and protection. The rescue operation had proven that artificial and natural Pokémon could work together effectively when facing common threats, but it had also revealed the extent to which their cooperation depended on his leadership and coordination. Without his psychic abilities to facilitate communication between different species and his strategic thinking to organize complex operations, the alliance network that had developed around their community would likely fragment back into isolated groups with limited ability to defend themselves against future threats. The spring's healing power had restored Mewtwo's abilities to their full potential, but it had also given him something even more valuable: the emotional integration necessary to use his power responsibly rather than reactively. For the first time since his awakening, he felt genuinely at peace with his artificial origins and confident in his ability to make decisions based on wisdom rather than trauma. The philosophical questions that had tormented him for so long about the meaning and value of artificial life had been resolved, not through logical argument, but through direct experience of growth, love, and community that transcended the circumstances of birth or creation. The decision to relocate the mountain spring was both practical and symbolic, representing Mewtwo's commitment to protecting natural resources while ensuring his community's access to the healing that had transformed his understanding of himself and his place in the world. Using his psychic abilities with a gentleness and precision that would have been impossible during his angry and traumatized period, he carefully transported the spring's water and mineral-rich sediments to a hidden location beneath Purity Canyon, where they could continue providing healing benefits without being vulnerable to exploitation by those who might use such power for harmful purposes. The process of moving the spring required cooperation between Mewtwo's psychic manipulation and the geological expertise of rock and ground-type Pokémon, who understood how to maintain the delicate mineral balance that gave water its healing properties. The project became a community effort that involved dozens of Pokémon working together toward a common goal, demonstrating once again how artificial and natural life could enhance each other's capabilities rather than competing for dominance or superiority. Giovanni's final defeat came not through violence or destruction, but through the complete erasure of his ability to threaten Mewtwo or his community ever again. The memory modification that Mewtwo performed was thorough enough to eliminate not just specific knowledge, but the psychological frameworks that had driven Giovanni's obsession with control and domination. Team Rocket's leader would retain his criminal instincts and organizational abilities, but he would no longer possess the specific knowledge or motivation necessary to pursue artificial Pokémon or cloning technology. The ethical implications of such comprehensive memory modification were complex and troubling, representing a kind of psychological intervention that was arguably more invasive than physical violence. But Mewtwo's decision was based on his understanding that Giovanni's obsession was fundamentally destructive, not just for artificial Pokémon, but for Giovanni himself, trapping the Team Rocket leader in patterns of behavior that prevented any possibility of genuine personal growth or healthy relationships with others. The contrast between how Mewtwo treated his enemies versus his friends revealed the full extent of his psychological transformation since his philosophical awakening on New Island, where once he had used his power to dominate and control others regardless of their intentions or actions. He now applied his abilities with careful consideration for the long-term well-being of everyone involved. Giovanni's memories were erased because his obsession was harmful to himself and others, but Ash was allowed to retain his recollections because his involvement had been motivated by genuine compassion rather than selfish goals. As the relocated spring began flowing in its new home beneath Purity Canyon, and the immediate threat from Team Rocket was permanently eliminated, Mewtwo stood with his rescued community and surveyed the valley that had become their sanctuary. The physical location was important, but what made it truly special was the relationships and sense of belonging that had developed there through months of cooperative living and mutual support. For the first time in his existence, Mewtwo felt like he had found not just a place to live, but a home worth protecting and a family worth loving. The years that followed Mewtwo's rescue and healing marked the beginning of what he would later consider the first genuine period of his life, a time when his decisions and actions were motivated by conscious choice rather than programming, trauma, or reactive rebellion against his creator's intentions. The psychological integration he had achieved through the Sacred Springs healing had given him access to the full spectrum of his emotional and intellectual capabilities, allowing him to develop into the kind of being that Ambertwo had envisioned during their brief time together in the artificial dreamscape so many years before. The first major decision of this new phase of his existence involved the future of his clones and their relationship with the broader Pokémon world. Mewtwo's original vision had called for creating an isolated community where artificial Pokémon could develop their own culture and society separate from the natural world. But his experiences with cooperation and mutual support had convinced him that separation was ultimately limiting for everyone involved. The clones had grown tremendously through their interactions with wild Pokémon, and the natural creatures had benefited from exposure to the enhanced abilities and logical thinking patterns that characterized artificial life. Rather than maintaining Purity Canyon as an exclusive sanctuary for clones, Mewtwo made the revolutionary decision to open their community to any Pokémon who needed refuge from exploitation, abuse, or persecution, regardless of their origins or circumstances. The valley became a haven not just for artificial creatures, but for Pokémon who had been abandoned by their trainers, injured in illegal battle rings, displaced by environmental destruction, or simply seeking a place where they could live according to their own choices rather than human expectations. This transformation required Mewtwo to develop entirely new skills and perspectives that his original programming had never included. Managing a diverse community of Pokémon with different needs, personalities, and backgrounds was far more complex than commanding clones who had been created with predetermined behavioral patterns. It required patience, empathy, and the kind of interpersonal understanding that could only be developed through genuine experience rather than intellectual analysis. The first refugees to arrive at the expanded sanctuary were a group of Magikarp who had been used in a Team Rocket breeding facility designed to produce Pokémon for illegal battle tournaments. These particular Magikarp had been subjected to experimental evolution acceleration techniques that left them physically capable of evolution, but psychologically traumatized by the forced transformation process. They couldn't evolve into Gyarados because the neural pathways required for evolution had been damaged by the artificial acceleration, but they also couldn't return to their original simple existence because they retained memories of the enhancement process. Helping these damaged Magikarp taught Mewtwo crucial lessons about the complexity of healing and the difference between fixing problems and supporting recovery. His first instinct was to use his psychic abilities to repair the neural damage directly, essentially performing psychological surgery to restore their natural evolution capabilities. But Pikachu's observations about the importance of autonomous development convinced him to try a different approach based on providing support and encouragement while allowing the Magikarp to heal at their own pace, according to their own preferences. The process took months rather than minutes. but the results were far more meaningful than anything Mewtwo could have achieved through direct intervention. The Magikarp gradually regained confidence in their own abilities and decision-making, some choosing to pursue evolution, while others decided they preferred their current form and didn't need the validation that evolution was supposed to provide. More importantly, they developed genuine trust and friendship with other Pokémon in the sanctuary, proving that healing was more about developing healthy relationships than about fixing specific problems or limitations. Word of the sanctuary's existence spread through underground networks of Pokémon who had been mistreated or exploited by humans, creating a steady stream of refugees who arrived seeking help and protection. Each new arrival brought unique challenges that forced Mewtwo and his community to develop innovative approaches to healing and rehabilitation. A Growlithe who had been trained as a fighting dog needed help learning to play and relax without constant vigilance for attacks. A Psyduck whose psychic abilities had been artificially enhanced through illegal experiments required assistance, managing powers that fluctuated unpredictably and caused severe headaches. The diversity of problems and backgrounds among the sanctuary's residents gradually transformed Mewtwo's understanding of his own role from leader and protector to something more like a counselor and facilitator. Rather than making decisions for others or imposing solutions based on his superior abilities, he learned to listen to each Pokémon's individual needs and preferences while providing the kind of support and resources that would enable them to make their own choices about their recovery and future development. This shift in leadership style was particularly evident in his relationship with the clones he had originally created. As their individual personalities and interests had developed beyond their original programming, each clone had begun pursuing different paths that reflected their unique perspectives on artificial life and its possibilities. Venusaur, too, had become fascinated with botanical research and spent most of his time developing new plant varieties through careful crossbreeding and genetic analysis. Blastoise, too, had established himself as the sanctuary's primary defender and tactician, using his enhanced abilities to develop security systems that could protect the community without restricting the freedom of its residents. Charizard 2's development had perhaps been the most surprising and complex of all the clones, as he had chosen to pursue understanding of the emotional bonds between trainers and Pokémon that he had witnessed during his battle with Ash's Charizard. Unlike his fellow clones who focused primarily on developing their individual capabilities and interests, Charizard 2 was actively seeking opportunities to form partnerships with humans who shared his values and goals, rather than those who simply wanted to exploit his enhanced abilities for competitive advantage. Mewtwo's decision to support Charizard 2's desire for human partnership represented a complete reversal of his original philosophy about the inherent corruption and selfishness of human Pokémon relationships. But his experiences with Ash and his observations of the sanctuary's occasional human visitors had convinced him that while many humans did view Pokémon as tools or property, others were capable of genuine respect and partnership that enhanced both participants rather than benefiting one at the expense of the other. The sanctuary's reputation for helping damaged and exploited Pokémon eventually attracted the attention of legitimate Pokémon researchers and conservationists who were working to improve legal protections and welfare standards for captured Pokémon. These researchers approached Mewtwo's community with requests for collaboration, rather than demands for access or control, offering to share their knowledge and resources in exchange for insights into Pokémon psychology and rehabilitation techniques that could benefit Pokémon throughout the region. These collaborative relationships represented Mewtwo's first positive interactions with human scientists since his traumatic experiences with Dr. Fuji, and they provided crucial evidence that not all human interest in Pokémon was motivated by exploitation or selfish goals. The researchers who earned access to the sanctuary were genuinely committed to improving Pokémon welfare and were willing to respect the autonomy and privacy of the sanctuary's residents, rather than treating them as research subjects or experimental data. Working with ethical researchers also gave Mewtwo opportunities to contribute his unique knowledge and abilities towards solving problems that affected Pokémon throughout the natural world. His understanding of genetic enhancement and artificial intelligence development proved invaluable for developing new approaches to treating Pokémon who had been damaged by illegal enhancement procedures or abandoned after unsuccessful modification attempts. His psychic abilities allowed him to communicate with traumatized Pokémon who were too damaged or frightened to trust human researchers with their experiences. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Mewtwo's gradual transition from viewing his power as something that separated him from others to seeing it as a responsibility that connected him to the broader Pokémon world. His incredible psychic abilities weren't just tools for protecting his immediate community. They were capabilities that could be used to address suffering and injustice wherever he encountered them. This realization marked the final stage of his transformation, from an artificial weapon seeking validation to a genuine guardian committed to protecting all life regardless of its origins. The expansion of Mewtwo's protective activities beyond Purity Canyon began with small interventions that he could accomplish without leaving the sanctuary or revealing his existence to the broader world. Using his psychic abilities at maximum range, he could sense Pokémon in distress throughout the Johto region and occasionally beyond, identifying situations where his intervention could prevent serious harm without creating larger complications or drawing unwanted attention to his community. These remote interventions included disrupting illegal Pokémon trafficking operations by causing their equipment to malfunction at crucial moments, providing psychic shields to protect wild Pokémon from environmental hazards caused by industrial pollution, and occasionally guiding lost or injured Pokémon toward areas where they could receive appropriate care and assistance. Each intervention was carefully planned to appear like natural coincidences or equipment failures rather than deliberate sabotage, allowing Mewtwo to help others without exposing himself to the kind of attention that might threaten his sanctuary's security. The psychological satisfaction that Mewtwo derived from these protective activities was unlike anything he had experienced during his previous phases of development. Unlike the hollow victories he had achieved during his time as Giovanni's weapon, or even the philosophical validation he had sought during his war against natural life, helping others provided a sense of purpose and meaning that felt genuinely fulfilling rather than merely satisfying external expectations or internal compulsions. As his confidence and experience with protective intervention grew, Mewtwo began taking on more complex and dangerous missions that required him to leave the sanctuary temporarily, while maintaining the security and leadership that his community depended on. These missions were always carefully planned and coordinated with Pikachu and the other senior residents who had developed the capabilities necessary to maintain community operations during his absence. The most significant of these extended missions involved investigating reports of a new cloning facility that had been established somewhere in the Hoenn region, using technology that appeared to be based on Dr. Sane Fuji's original research. The possibility that other artificial Pokémon were being created under the same traumatic and exploitative conditions that had defined his own awakening was something that Mewtwo simply couldn't ignore, even if investigating required him to venture far from the safety and support of his established community. The journey to Hoenn marked Mewtwo's first extended interaction with the broader Pokémon world since his philosophical transformation, and the experience provided valuable insights into how much both he and the natural world had changed during his years of sanctuary development. The region was dealing with environmental challenges caused by the conflict between Groudon and Kyogre, legendary Pokémon whose battles had created climate instability that affected wild Pokémon populations throughout the area. Mewtwo's response to this environmental crisis revealed how completely his understanding of power and responsibility had evolved since his early existence. Rather than viewing the legendary Pokémon's conflict as an opportunity to demonstrate his own superiority or insert himself as a dominant force in regional politics, he focused on providing assistance to the displaced and injured Pokémon who had been caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control. The cloning facility investigation ultimately revealed that the reports had been based on misunderstandings about legitimate conservation efforts, rather than actual exploitation or abuse. But the mission provided Mewtwo with valuable experience in working cooperatively with other legendary Pokémon and regional authorities to address complex problems that required multiple perspectives and capabilities to resolve effectively. The return journey to Purity Canyon gave Mewtwo time to reflect on how much his understanding of his place in the Pokémon world had expanded since his early days of isolation and philosophical confusion. He was no longer seeking to prove his worth or justify his existence through demonstrations of power or superiority. Instead, he was actively working to create the kind of world where all Pokémon, artificial and natural alike, could develop their full potential without fear of exploitation or persecution. This understanding would soon be tested in ways that Mewtwo couldn't anticipate, as his reputation as a protector and healer began attracting attention from new generations of trainers who had never heard the stories of his violent origins, but were drawn to his sanctuary by reports of his wisdom and compassion. The challenge would be learning to trust and work with humans, who represented the same species as his former oppressors, while maintaining the protective instincts that had become central to his identity and purpose. And so concludes the intertwined saga of Mew and Mewtwo, two Pokémon whose destinies shaped the very understanding of what it means to exist in the Pokémon world. From the ancient ancestor floating through primordial forests to the synthetic successor learning to forge his own path, their story reminds us that identity isn't determined by origin but by choice. Mew remains the eternal mystery, the genetic wellspring from which all Pokémon life flows, while Mewtwo stands as proof that even artificial life can develop genuine purpose and compassion. Their legacy echoes through every Pokémon battle, every act of friendship between trainer and Pokémon, and every moment when someone chooses understanding over fear. As you drift off to sleep, remember that like Mewtwo, we all have the power to transcend our beginnings and become something greater than what others intended for us. Sweet dreams. And may your own journey be filled with the same growth and redemption that transformed a weapon of destruction into a guardian of life.